On. Welcome, everybody. We are now live with our second Gen Con presentation, and we've got our illustrious panel here to help share the fun and frolic. So this is our last battles of World War II in Europe and the Pacific, and I'm going to start off with some basic information and put this at full screen so you can all see it. Essentially, what we're going to do today is I want to hit a couple high points. One is, who's NSDM? Well, we're a nonprofit educational group, and we do seminars and games at conventions. We're all volunteers. Nobody's given us any money to do this, and we try to be as apolitical as we can because we're not here to grind things out. We're here to share what we think we learned along the way. Keep in mind that all of the folks here are doing stuff on public information. Nobody's using classified or secret stuff. All the pictures and stuff we use is under fair use and Creative Commons. And if we screw up any facts, it's because it's us. Okay. You can see us this year on our Facebook page, which is primarily where we share news articles of interest. But we also plan to be at DragonCon online and Escape Velocity online. Also, I'd like to point out, if you're interested in real world war games and the design of them, you should come to Connections USA 2020, 10 to 14 August, and it's online, and you can see the Connections website so that you can see how to register. So the first speaker that we're going to have up is Matt Caffrey. Matt Caffrey is what I like to call the dean of Air Force wargaming, because Matt's been in this business longer than most of our audience has probably been around. And he's also a recent author of a book called On Wargaming, which is available through the Naval War College Press for free as a PDF, or through the General Printing Office for about $45. It's now in its second printing because it's proved to be the most popular Naval War College article or book in recorded history. So I'm going to change the view a little bit here. I don't think I can bring Matt front and center, but I'll have him here on the side. Wave at everybody, Matt. Okay, that's Matt, so you know who he is. And we're going to go right to the presentation, and I'm going to let Matt lead off. I've got a preliminary slide here that shows a number of pictures of the different military forces in 1945. You know, it's really hard to find a Soviet aircraft picture in combat.
You succeeded, though.
I did succeed. I found one. And now we're going to go to Matt's presentation. He's going to start with Europe and then move on to the Pacific. So I'm going to go on mute, and you take it away, Matt.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much. Next. Okay, so one of the, whoops, back up. Okay, so the first thing is, there we go. Stay. Whoop. Lots of fun. Down one. All right. So the main point, and this is kind of also a decision, a attention step, is that according to at least one author, and I think he's right, air power wins World War II in the European theater 6 weeks before it would have been won anyway by the forces on the ground. And by the end of the presentation, you'll see what I'm talking about. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the traditional narrative about air power in World War II. One is that fighter command is the heroes of Battle of Britain, and really the heroes of the time that Britain stood alone. They didn't stand alone, but that's another story. And bomber command are these terrible people that, we're out bombing civilians. As far as the U.S. Army Air Forces go, the big Schweinhorst Regensburg raid proved that the airmen were all a bunch of zealots, and their whole theory didn't work. And then the P-51 came along to save the day, and with using the bombers as bait, the P-51s shot down the Luftwaffe and made D-Day possible. traditional narrative and again, anytime you try to pick a traditional narrative, there are people that disagree with it. But that's you hear this often and over again. This is wrong in most ways. Next. Okay, so one of the reasons why I think it's important that we talk about why it's wrong is that there were lessons not learned and hence not applied. And so when we go into future wars, air power is not used as effectively as it could have been. And as a result, the wars had higher casualties and last longer for lack of really understanding where air power was effective and where it wasn't. Okay, next. So a little bit of background. All the hype and Hollywood version and popular view of the Battle of Britain was mostly right. I mean, they really did save civilization. The few that so many owed so much to. It wasn't completely right. One of the things most people tell you is they were running out of airplanes and people. They weren't running out of airplanes. They were producing airplanes, fighters faster than they were losing them. But they were running short of trained fighter pilots. The other thing that's a little bit wrong is that it really wasn't alone. They had the Canadians, a lot of Poles. There's a good new movie out on that. And also the traditional narrative doesn't really cover the ground attack part of the RAF, but that was very important. North Africa and a lot of other places. And Bomber Command early in the war really didn't have the capability to hit a target any smaller than a city. Very early in the war, the Germans tried to figure out what Bomber Command was aiming at in order to put more anti-aircraft there and design their defense. And they were unable to determine the target of the British attack based on where the bombs landed. So insanely inaccurate bombing. As far as the U.S. Army Air Force, they were the first forces into the fight. They were in the fight in Europe in the very, very early. You have a big component of the U.S. Army Air Force that is counter land, and that really isn't covered very much, but it really played a big part, especially if the land component and the air guys worked together well. Patton used his air power to serve as a cavalry screen as he dashed across France. And then the 8th Air Force, you tend to see the pictures of the shot up B-17s and the brave crews and all the rest. But we really did a horrible job of picking targets. We tended to hit all the wrong things until fairly late in the war. More on that. Next slide. Okay, so what are some of the last battles? Probably one of the key ones for the RAF is the Operation Market Garden. That one of the reasons why that failed is that we were unable, the folks, particularly at the tip of the spear, were unable to talk to air power. They were, as parachutists, they were lightly armed. They were more dependent on air power than most ground forces, and they just couldn't communicate. And a lot of people know that the British radios weren't working. Well, there were supposed to be two ground support parties from the Army Air Force there, and the classic Hollywood scene of the forward air controllers all lined up and the colonel talking to them and say, this is a dangerous mission. If anybody wants to not volunteer, they won't be thought less of them. And one of the two teams were like, oh, okay, well then we won't volunteer. If there's no repercussions and you'd understand, then we don't want to do this. So there was one team to talk to the entire U.S. Air Force. And that was one of the bombers that got one of the few transports that got shot down on the first day. And so we had all these aircraft, U.S. and British, with munitions that could have intervened, it wasn't for lack of air power, but it was for lack of the communications to bring those air power in. Then you have Bomber Command with growing capabilities, but with mostly static targeting. Early in the war, they had to go after cities because even as they slowly started to get better targeting, that just meant more of the bombs hit the cities. But later in the war, their radar improved and they got much better, and they could have hit targets that were smaller. And one of the things that Merle asked me to bring up is this whole business about, the British bombing and the morality and all the rest. I think what's moral is to do the least harm. And early in the war, hitting Hamburg was as good as they could do. But later in the war, their radars became more accurate, their bombing became more accurate. And I think it was technologically feasible to bomb with greater discrimination. And so I think some of the criticism of the Bomber Command is warranted, but only very late in the war when they had the ability to do differently. Also, one reason Merle had trouble finding a picture of the Russian Air Force is that it's usually left out. And one reason it's left out is that it was pretty irrelevant very early in the war. And then later in the war, when most of the historians are focusing on what the U.S. forces are doing, it becomes a really very potent force. And that gets commented on very seldom. But late in the war, very, very capable force. Next slide.
Yeah, can I make a comment
Sure.
on that?
Yes,
Mark. Yes, I think a lot of what the criticism of Bomber Command also was our horror when we thought that we had killed 220,000 people at Dresden, when in fact that was German propaganda that caused us to secure area bombing, and because we actually started to get scared of what we were doing.
And again, the propaganda made it worse. At first, the Russians started to feed that propaganda, but then we were able to show them the request from them to hit Dresden and 3 other cities. So they became less vocal after that. And again, my point is that it wasn't immoral to hit Dresden because forces were being funneled through Dresden and other cities to respond to a Russian breakthrough. So it wasn't like it's late in the war and it couldn't be hit at all. It was that it was late in the war and it could have been hit with greater discrimination. So we did more damage to the transportation infrastructure and less damage to people.
Sure. I just think if it had been known that we had killed about 20,000 people at Dresden instead of 200,000 people, I don't think there would have been the same type of emotional pushback.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
That's all I'm trying.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's all. I'll give it back to you. Thanks, man.
Okay, my pleasure. Well, this is good. It's better to just not have one person doing all the talking. Okay, so again, late air battles. Very few people know about just how important air power was in the advance across France and everything else. Patton, in particular, was very skillful in his use of air power. A lot of innovative techniques. The air bomber guys are still picking dumb targets. They have a lot of help picking dumb targets. Probably the worst of it. There was an operation called Operation Crossbow, which was trying to suppress the V1 and V2 raids. A lot of Brits were dying. British had been in the war since '39. We could not do it, but a lot of times we were hitting dummy targets, and it was taking a lot of our sorties. And if we had employed air power more effectively during Operation Market Garden, and if the Brits had gotten just a few miles further north, they would have cut off the only viable line of supply for those V1, V2 launchers that would have been within range of London, and they would have stopped the Hungary season for the more urban parts of the Netherlands. So, one thing going wrong has a ripple effect. Also, not very well known is the air battle over the Bulge. I did an article on this for Strategy and Tactics years ago, but everybody knows Battle of the Bulge is probably the most war games thing. You almost never hear about the air battle of the Bulge, and I think it would be good to look at. It would be good to war game, because Battle of the Bulge with a good game usually turns out the way it did historically, because both we and the Germans played the ground game pretty well. Well, the German didn't play the air part very well at all. We did. And one of the innovative things we did is we used radar that had been used to try to spot German aircraft. We used it to figure out where we were, and we would locate the radar right next to Corps Artillery Headquarters, which had where the blue forces were located, all plotted. So if we had a break in the clouds and we saw some tanks or something below us, we could check with the folks back at the headquarters would know where the aircraft were. They could check with the artillery folks to know where we were. And if they saw tanks and they weren't ours, then they were cleared to drop. And there's a wonderful little write-up in a little monogram about they're interviewing this German prisoner of war, and his formation, it was one of the lead formations, Piper or somebody, got hit by these air bombs coming out of the sky. It was mostly overcast. They thought they were safe from air power, and they had all been at the Falaise Gap, and they were like, "Oh my God, this is terrible." And people are driving off the road and diving into ditches, and you can almost imagine the interviewer like, "Oh, this is great. I'm an air power guy, and they're going to talk about how it just devastated their column. And so how many tanks did we knock out?" And the POW is like, now that you mention it, I don't think we lost any tanks, but we sure lost a lot of time. And that was very crucial at that part of the fight. And then air power won the war with a lot of help. And what we're talking about there is this great book called The Fall of the German War Economy, which basically tells the story of how our efforts against synthetic oil, but particularly against the railroads in and out of the war, cut Germany off from its coal supply. So all across Germany, factories shut down, and not because they were bombed or the people wouldn't go to work, though there was some of that towards the end of the war. It was because the generators ran dry and ran out of fuel. One of the footnotes, we found an Me-262 factory in like 1953, and it had stopped producing Me-262s on the 12th of February of 44, not because we had bombed it, we didn't know it was there, but because they ran out of coal and they didn't have ventilation, much less the ability to produce any aircraft. So very, very crucial, very useful. And it begs the question, if we won the war by turning off the German nation, could have we done that sooner? And the author talked at one of the earlier Connections conferences, and his opinion was not much sooner, because while it was easy to hit marshalling yards, it was also easy to fix them, and that we needed to be fairly late in the war so that we could keep hitting them over and over again, just about every day. And he felt maybe air power could have shortened the war 6 weeks sooner. I think it might have been even earlier than that if we were able to use air power more effectively and push Market Garden all the way up, not to go to Berlin, but just to go to the Zuider Zee. Next slide.
So, Matt, before we move on, one of the other things I wanted to point out that really surprised me as I was doing some recent reading, that right about the time of the Bulge, just after, Goering organized a 1,000 aircraft raid where they lost 139 pilots.
Thank you. I was going to mention that. We had talked about how the Germans did poorly in the Bulge, and we did well. I mentioned what we did well. I didn't mention anything about the Germans doing poorly. To maintain, so go back for just a second, to maintain surprise, they kept training these guys. They were going to do, just as the Battle of the Bulge was going to break us on the ground, they were going to have 1,000 aircraft hit the bomber stream, and after weeks and weeks of not losing a lot of bombers, they were gonna cause us to lose a lot of bombers, and we would pull back like after Regensburg. Well, then they decided no, they were all going to do ground. Then they decided, well, they were going to do half and half. So half hitting the bombers wasn't very effective, and the half that they put over to ground attack had been training for air to air. So you have pilots and aircraft, but training is a factor too. And then they decided, okay, we're going to have this big offensive counter-air operation. We're going to hit the Allied airfields. But then they decided, oh, we're going to wait till New Year's Day because American fighter pilots are all a bunch of drunks, and they're party boys and egomaniacs. Well, anyway, and they're going to be all drunk New Year's Eve, so nobody will be sober, and we'll be able to take them out without a fight. Well, Battle of the Bulge is pretty well over by the 1st of January. If they were going to do a big anti-air attack, they would have had to done it early so that it could have an effect on the fight on the ground. They didn't do a very good job of telling their own anti-aircraft. And by that point in the Battle of the Bulge, these guys had gotten beat up a lot by American air power. So they were shooting at anything in the sky. So they lost a lot of their aircraft and pilots to their own anti-aircraft gunners. And then because there was a big push that this was going to be a maximum effort, a lot of the group commanders and the squadron commanders and the real leadership of the combat Luftwaffe, the combat leaders, were all on that mission, and a whole bunch of them got killed. So it's been called the death ride of the Luftwaffe, and they didn't have the same organizational capability. They didn't have the same operational capability after the Bulge. So it was if anything, it was a more devastating loss in the air to the Germans than it was on the ground, and very few people know that aspect of it. So on to the next slide. Thank you, Merle. So let's summarize a little bit. Albert Speer, who was in charge of the German war production, was asked after the war just how much of an impact the bombing had. And he said, well, we had these planning factors, and we knew what we had done the math, and we knew we could produce, and we knew what we did produce. So we went back by different years, and a lot of the hit was late in the war. But he calculated the air attacks resulted in almost 15,000 fewer artillery pieces being manufactured, over 10,000 fewer armored vehicles being manufactured, and 1 million less munitions. But he pointed out that's only part of the story, because there was 15,000 artillery pieces that were produced, but they were all used to shoot at bombers. And if they weren't required to shoot at bombers, they would have been, the 88s are very capable on ground attack. And then they fired off over 50 million rounds during the war. And if those 50 million rounds were shot at infantrymen, you would have had a lot higher casualties. And then from all of our attacks, mainly the British, but us too, 70 square miles of urban area were destroyed within Greater Germany, and all that is true and appropriate and all the rest. But the main thing is we turned Germany off, and this is part of the. If we had realized this, if it was our attention all along, we would have been much better off. A lot of our missions went to hit. A lot of our missions were used to hit aircraft engine factories and aircraft airframe factories. After the war, we found German aircraft everywhere. They were in barns, they were in civilian airfields, they were in the factories. They were all over the place. Most of them had never been flown in combat because they didn't have the fuel. And if we had taken out the fuel and we had taken out the coal, it really wouldn't have mattered if they were factories. And that's a lesson that we didn't even, not only did we not learn for future wars, but we didn't learn for the other major theater of this war. And that will be one of the main points of my next talk. So that's that. Any Q&A now, Merle?
Yeah, we've got a question from Hannibal.
Yep.
Can you explain a bit more about the target improvements towards the end of the war? Was it better accuracy, better intel, or mix?
Mainly it was better accuracy. we had one of the embarrassing things is even before the war, there were factions that said we should concentrate on some future war. We should concentrate on synthetic oil, and we should concentrate on transportation. Germany was the leading exporter of machine tools, and with the blockade, they couldn't export those machine tools. So even if we succeeded in blowing up the factory, they would just use some of the machine tools to replace the ones we destroyed that they weren't able to ship overseas. Germany did not have enough oil on the first day of the war. So every gallon of oil we destroyed was 1 gallon less. Also, Germany's economy ran almost entirely on coal. In the United States, we have some nuclear plants, we have some hydroelectric, we have, all sorts of different power sources. With the exception of just a few hydroelectric, Germany was like 90-something, 97% electricity. So as the war progressed, we finally began to figure out, yes, these were the right target sets. In part, we had intercepted and German communications that dealt with production and all the rest. But since priority went to the orders maneuvering the ground forces, those got translated and decoded first. Well, we finally started decoding 7-month-old messages from factories saying, hey, we're running out of coal. We will not be able to produce as many artillery pieces as we were assigned to produce because we have 7 days worth of coal and it's 30-day month. So you're going to get less than a third. And this was like 10 months before the end of the war, and 7 months old by the time that it was decoded and translated. So the intelligence was finally catching up, but mainly it was the radar. Very, very early, our radars were pretty lousy. And not only did it have to be a big city, it helped it was a big city on the coast like Hamburg. As the war progressed, radars got higher resolution, lighter, more dependable. There was actually a Life magazine article about the technology that won the war, and it was this big spread with lots of photographs of how radar won World War II. And then days before the issue was to go to press, the atomic bomb was dropped. They got rid of that main feature article and did a new feature article on the atomic bomb. But I think there was some accuracy in what they said in the first place. Radar did really have a huge role in it. So by the low, one of the ironies, and one thing to mention real quickly, we did daylight precision bombing with heavily armed aircraft with smaller bomb loads. And the U.S. idea was if we hit more critical targets and we actually hit the target more often, we're going to have more damage. And even if we lose more aircraft during the day, we'll still be more effective in bombing. And the British were, well, we're not going to have as many guns. We're going to fly at night, so it'll be harder for the Germans to see us, but we'll have much bigger bomb loads. And even if some of our bombs miss, we're going to be more accurate. Well, very late in the war, there was a time period where, partially because the P-51 was so successful, partially because of better tactics and some other things, we were losing very few aircraft during the air, during the day. But Britain's better radar was allowing them to hit targets more precisely at night. So the bombing at night, even though it was at night with the better radar, was having more accurate bomb results. But because the German night bomber force hadn't been decimated, they were losing more aircraft at night than we were during the day. So it was reversed. They were getting better accuracy, but suffering more losses at night. And we were suffering fewer losses in the day, but we weren't matching them in accuracy.
So we have another question. This one's from Hector. And basically he says that we mentioned a few times the air battleable bulge is not commonly discussed. And could we speculate or comment on why we think that's the case? And I'll take the first shot at that and then let you top me, because
Sure.
I think the main reason is everyone perceived the German Air Force was already effectively destroyed. And the real information on losses, the losses were in like December and January. So the war was over before we really had a lot of information. I mean, imagine that the code breakers had some info on that, but it really hadn't become public information. So it was sort of buried by a lot of historians.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think also, I mean, it was a ground fight. So if you're a historian, you want to write about the Battle of the Bulge, you go talk to the sergeant, you talk to the corps commander, you talk to the folks that were the part of the fight. Air was kind of out of sight and out of mind, and then you have this myth that air power didn't fly. We've all seen the movie Patton. Airplanes didn't fly. Then Patton's chaplain came up with a good prayer, and then air power shows up, but it's after the crisis has passed, or the passing of the crisis. And the truth is, there was only one day during the battle where the weather was so bad, there were 3 flights, 3 sorties by the Allies in Europe. Man, how many aircraft? 3 is insanely few, but most of the days they flew. And they were out with this innovative tactics. They were able to intervene in the ground fight, even most days of the ground fight. And in the days they didn't, and you could only control so many aircraft at a time with this radar, they went after the German fuel supplies. So a lot of the problem was getting the fuel forward, but a lot of the problem was oil drums have a pretty decent radar return, and we knew what bridges they had to get stuff over, and we pretty much knew where it was. So a lot of missions went against their fuel and their other supplies, and that was one of the reasons why the Germans ran out of gas. They were short on gas to start with, so everything we blew up made them even shorter.
Okay, Matt, we're ready to move to the air war in the Pacific. And just as a time check, we're about 30 minutes in. So if you can pick up the pace slightly,
yes, yeah, I will.
You'll be able to make your meetings on time.
Oh, that's fine.
So now we're into what might have been.
Oh, yeah, let's do what might have been. So, we talked about how, they won the war when it was about to be won anyway. But could have they done it quicker? And I think they could have. Early in the fight, air really wasn't, the bombers really weren't that effective, and they were helping the Germans figure out how to counter them. So we could have done a better job of selecting targets right from the beginning, and we could have given more of the bombers to the Navy. We would have been able to build up for the cross-channel invasion faster if we were able to suppress the submarines faster. And giving bombers to the Navy, inter service forever really a bad thing to do, might have been politically difficult. But the submarine shelters were bomb-proof anyway. It just mission after mission would lose experienced crews, bombers, and not have any effect. Slightly fewer heavy bombers over Normandy. It's hard to argue with a success, but it was never sent to me, but a friend said he read the report from Patton's chief engineer, and he said one of the reasons Patton ran out of fuel wasn't that it was given to Montgomery, it was that the stupid Army Air Force had done such a thorough job of blowing up all the bridges, and had blown up all around the bridges and the supports to the bridges and the bankments to the bridges, that they took forever to get the things back open again. So that would have actually helped the Army if you don't overdo it. And then again, order the U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force ground party into Arnhem. And we could have ended crossbow earlier if those missiles couldn't get within range of London. And then Bomber Command switching to oil and transportation when they could. Again, early in the war, they had no choice. They didn't have the accuracy. Late in the war, they had the choice. They should have made the choice. And then with all that, we would have suppressed German production way earlier. A lot of the fight in the Battle of the Bulge came from weapons produced since D-Day. And without those new weapons being manufactured, or with fewer of them being manufactured, it might have turned out to be the Battle of the Dent, not the Battle of the Bulge. And then finally, that could not help but win the war in Europe quicker. And that would have had an effect also on where we met the Soviets, that they were having trouble moving forward just from logistical points of view. A weaker Germany would have helped them too, but we might have met at a different location. And if we had met, just one major river further east, that would have had a profound effect on the danger and the scope of the Cold War that would follow. Okay, next slide, next theater. Okay, and again, one more slide. The cost of ignorance. So we didn't really think of the enemy as a system. The kill chain broken in Korea. Just as in Market Garden, we had aircraft that weren't very effective because we didn't have the people on the ground to talk to them. Early in the Korean War, we had fighter bombers showing up with nobody on the ground to talk to us, to tell us where to hit. In Europe, we didn't have the intelligence to tell us that we needed to be going after the transportation. And so in the bombing in Korea, we didn't know that the hydroelectric attacks were having a huge impact on not only the North Korean, but the Chinese, more importantly, the Chinese economy. And there's a little snippet in one of the histories about the Chinese, like, we're beaten, this is terrible, and being told, yeah, but the Americans don't know they beat us, so let's not say anything, and maybe they won't realize how effective their attacks have been. And then a lot of what should have been known from the bombing survey, when you bombing is a race between the builders and the bombers, and all these bombing halts in Vietnam really hurt us. So next slide and next issue, and I'll try to talk faster. I will be able to talk faster. There's less to talk about in Europe. Okay, and you guys can read these, some great books about learning more about the air war in Europe. Next slide. Okay, so air power
in the Pacific. We've got some Mustangs and B-29s, and now we start Matt's slides.
Yep. Okay, so air power wins the war in the Pacific theater months before naval and air power would have won it anyway. But we won it with, certainly fewer casualties, certainly the U.S. side, but I maintain on all sides, it was a much better state of peace. So next slide. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about, a little bit about, and as far as background, again, air power was the first to fight in the Pacific. The Flying Tigers, actually before the war started, I was a ROTC cadet before we acknowledged that the Flying Tigers were covert operation. Flying Tigers that died wouldn't get an honor guard at their funeral. That's another story for another day. But to give credit where it's due, the Doolittle raid, people talk about Doolittle, but he needed that aircraft carrier to take off from. So a joint op before joint was sexy. Early on, the Battle of Midway, very much misunderstood. The land-based air didn't hit a darn thing. But there's something called operational suppression, where you keep the other guy down. And there's a great, relatively new book called Shattered Sword that talks about all those sorties from Midway, kept delayed the Japanese ability to turn around their aircraft. So they were full of fuel and sitting on the deck when the Navy came in and achieved their great victory. Then another thing that's often unknown is that Kenny, working for MacArthur in Southwest Pacific, were considered by many to be the guy that came up with the strategy of island hopping. Also early in the war, that's not known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where basically Kenny, using modified aircraft and innovative tactics, sunk a Japanese division. I mean, there's some quibbling about advance parties and people who were in hospitals, so they weren't aboard the ships, but they sunk a Japanese division. Think of how many U.S. casualties it would take if that division was sunk, dug in on an island, and we had to go after them. And there's an interesting anecdote. Kenny goes in to see MacArthur, all upset about the press release. And MacArthur says, "Oh, no, we talked about what a great victory it is. How could you possibly be upset?" And says, I'm upset because you put in the press release that casualties were low. Says, well, what's wrong with that? Says, we didn't have any casualties. And MacArthur said, yeah, well, nobody would have believed that. So I said casualties were low. So we basically killed a Japanese division and didn't lose a single aircrew member. Next slide. So let's now talk about the last battles and really the last battles of the Army Air Force. And by saying post D-Day, we're going to start with Operation Matterhorn and then go on to the main event, the operations from the Marianas. Next. Okay, so Operation Matterhorn, they moved 4 groups of B-29s based in India with advanced fields in China. And the idea was the bombed up would be in India, the crews would sleep in India, but they would fly to China, refuel, and then take off to actually hit their targets. Incredibly bad from a logistics point of view. Took an awful lot of the logistics that could have been used for the Chinese Army for more tactical operations, and very little to show for it. We actually started before D-Day, 5th of June, but the target was Bangkok. There would have been better locations to hit that target. Japan isn't hit until the 15th of June. Not too bad as far as achieving damage. Next slide. Okay, and because of this, the horrible logistics, the B-29s averaged 1 sortie a month. Think of that. You know, today we talk about turning around the F-16 3 times a day, 1 sortie a month. And again, the log hurt the Chinese Army. During the entire period that the operation was taking place, they managed to attack Japan proper only 9 times. Lost 129 B-29s, only 22 of those over Japan. So a lot of them were just crossing the hump, and the new aircraft and teething problems and trying to maintain them in such a screwy setup. And then by the January of 1945, we basically just gave up and closed up the Chinese bases. Next slide. Okay, so basically, with the exception of Matterhorn, and by 45, the Matterhorn groups had joined the 21st Bomber Command. All the B-29s in the world that were operational ready were put into the Marianas. 6 really big bases. And on the 24th of November, so months after Matterhorn, to be fair, with the first large-scale attack on Japan, 111 aircraft, but only 24 hit the target. And it turns out that was one of the best attacks we would have of the entire war as far as daylight precision bombing goes. And one on the 27th of December, none of the bombs hit the target. And it wasn't that we didn't know where they were. By this point in the war, our radars were pretty good. Our navigation was pretty good. The reason was that the B-29s flew really, really high. And that put it so high, it was very difficult for the Japanese fighters to even reach them. It made it difficult targets for Japanese anti-aircraft. But when you're dropping your bombs from that high up, there's lots and lots of time for winds aloft to push your bombs to the right, to the left, forward, backwards. So the bombing computer would tell you you're right on target, but the bombs would actually fall well away from target. Well, the highest levels of command within the Army Air Force were really staking the future of an Air Force on this, and the importance of making this happen fast. LeMay had come in from Europe, had turned partially around Matterhorn, and so even though he was the youngest 2-star general in the Army Air Force, he was brought in to run this operation. And right away, by improved maintenance and different flight profiles. Very quickly, he had results to increase sorties, but the combat accuracy was no better until we got to the era of smart bombs, where the bomb itself guides. This trade-off between altitude and bomb accuracy went back to World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, until the advent of smart bombs. Next slide. So one of the things that wasn't done nearly as quickly as it could have been is something called Operation Starvation. Very early on, they do a test of dropping mines from the air. They really don't, and it's successful, but they really don't get started until March, and then they only start with one group. They don't even continue that. They take that group off the laying naval mines to participate in suppressing enemy airfields during the attacks on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Get back to it in mid-May, and in June they assign a second group to it. And the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey says that it was the most cost-effective attack of the entire war. Basically, Japan was going to die of starvation. The nation of Japan was going to die of starvation November of 1944 without a land invasion, without the atomic bomb, without anything else, just because Japan could not produce enough food to keep all the Japanese alive. And this effect was achieved with just a tiny fraction of the bombers being used far later in the war than they could have been used. Okay, next slide. What the bombers were used for, though, were firebomb raids, and just how the RAF, had to hit targets the size of Hamburg because that was as close as they could get. The Army Air Force decided they needed to go to more area night attacks with incendiaries because they just weren't hitting precision targets. So the first of these attacks killed, you can read it yourself, 83,000 plus people, and they continued that through March until they literally ran out of ammunition, ran out of the incendiary ammunition. Then they tried going back to precision attacks. And again, most attacks, very few bombs hit the targets because they were just flying so high. And mid-March to mid-May, not only the bombers dropping mines, but all the bombers were shifted over to suppress Japanese airfields for the attacks on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Next slide. Okay, then in April, the command comes to full strength with the last group showing up, 1,002 B-29s from May to mid-June, basically attacks on the major cities to the point where they decided there was not enough left standing in the major cities to keep hitting. Over 126,000 killed, 100 square miles of Japanese urban area destroyed. Now, if you remember the earlier briefing, 70 square miles of Germany was destroyed, mainly by the RAF, but U.S. also, over the entire length of the war. In just a couple of months, our B-29s destroy 100 square miles. So just mind-boggling. The next phase, the big cities aren't worthwhile targets anymore. So they start hitting medium-sized cities, and they start trying again on the point targets. And what they start doing is they're getting a little bit smarter in weather forecasting. And they look for days where the winds will be calm or at least consistent. And if that's not the weather, then they do the area attacks against the small cities. And they
Uh-oh, we just seem to have lost Matt. So we'll give him a second to see if he can reconnect. He's got like 5 slides left. Well, I'm not seeing him reconnect, so I guess we'll try to do justice, because we've got to get things moving along. It could be that the Axis found him. That's true. So his next slide was continuing along the general line, talking about the naval war and how carrier strikes supported the different landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. I'm trying to watch here to see if he comes back. How strategic strikes had had an impact, and how the UK has been sending CVs to the Pacific. A wider spectrum of target in the last wave was basically canceled due to surrender. Here he comes.
Okay.
All right.
So
back.
So they're also the Navy attack. So back to naval attacks. The carrier strikes, offensive counter against Japanese airfields. 11 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers. Mid-February, mainly in support of Tujan. Mid-March, Okinawa. Then strategic attacks by a fleet with 9 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, and 4 fleet carriers, courtesy of the United Kingdom. It was, again, something most people don't know about. A wide spectrum of targets hitting all sorts of stuff. And the last wave of these carrier attacks against targets in Japan was called off by the surrender. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there's a reorganization. It becomes Strategic Air Forces Pacific. The 20th Air Force the 20th Bomber Command becomes the 20th Air Force. The 8th Air Force is being brought over from Europe. Then there's going to be another command called Tiger Force from the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. But there's just one group that keeps all this from happening. They do 4 late July practice missions over Japan, where they drop just one big conventional bomb. And then on the 6th of August, they drop the bomb over Hiroshima, between 66 and 78,000 people killed. And then on the 9th of August, the target is covered by haze, so the bomb goes in against Nagasaki with 35,000 killed. And next slide. So what might have been? Several things. One is, instead of sending, we probably couldn't send no bombers to China, because President Roosevelt had promised the Chinese government, but we could have sent one group. The same number of sorties may have been achieved. In the fighting in North Africa, we had fighters forward, and we were getting very low sortie rates, and we withdrew a lot of the fighters, and the sortie rates actually went up. The fewer bombers to support would have damaged the Chinese military less, which would have helped them. And by giving the bombers to Kenny, he had wanted to get all the B-29s. He was going to take out the Japanese source of oil. And if the Japanese didn't have any fuel, they didn't have any kamikazes. So all those OCA attacks trying to take out the airfields, if the kamikaze didn't have any gas, it wouldn't matter how many aircraft they had. And Operation Starvation could have been started 6 months earlier. So think about it. If it could have been started 6 months earlier, and it would have caused the Japanese to run out of food in November, when would have they run out of food if it had been started earlier? And then the question is, would that have caused them to surrender? Next slide. Okay, well, now let's go back a slide just for a second. we had a problem with how do you get Japan to surrender. We could have maintained a naval blockade, and the Navy just going on station to kind of reinforce the mines. We could have landed an army, and the losses would have been absolutely horrendous. We could have done more conventional bombing in the hopes that that would have stopped the fight. And the issue is we had to do something. You know, we needed to cause Japan to surrender. We needed to end the war and start rebuilding the peace. So what would have been a mechanism that would have gotten Japan to surrender that would have resulted in fewer Japanese people getting killed, fewer Americans getting killed. And you know, through wargaming, we can kind of get some ideas about that, but you know, no one can ever know. You never know if a war game is taking everything into consideration that needs to be taken. Okay, next slide. So the cost of ignorance, by not really understanding what happened, by not thinking of enemy as a system, again, we missed the impact, the indirect effects of some of our attacks, the electrical power in North Korea. In Vietnam, we were thinking about strategic targets. What targets to hit in North Vietnam that were strategic that would result in crippling their ability to fight? We didn't learn the lesson from World War II that sometimes interdiction could have a strategic effect. Just as in World War II, we could have harmed the Japanese by cutting off their oil supplies. We could have harmed North Vietnam far more by cutting off their munitions and weapons coming into North Vietnam than to hit any target within North Vietnam. But that strategic target has to be into the country against industrial type targets is a fixation that we need to move beyond. Okay, next slide. So on this, there really isn't a lot written on the bomber offensive late in the war. One book I'd recommend is The Airplane That Defeated Hitler. It's written by Hansel, who was the boss of the 21st Bomber Command at first, and one of the big advocates for our bombers in the interwar period. So he's not exactly an objective author, but talk about getting information right from the horse's mouth. And even though this isn't on a late battle, the book Shattered Sword is really something that you know, so many decades after the Battle of Midway, he really showed very clearly that our perception of that battle had been wrong for decades and decades, and anybody with any interest in any part of the Pacific Theater needs to review that book. Okay, that's all I have. Sorry to go long. Sorry to the other panelists. Any questions, comments, clarifications?
Waiting for questions. We're not seeing anything yet. But thank you, Matt. We're glad that we could get you lined up for your meeting. We could listen to you a lot longer. Next time we'll have to remember to do the air war entirely separately as a presentation.
My apologies.
Yes. But that's fine. Okay, well, we're going to let you go and move on to the next section. Let me queue up some slides. Basically, our plan is to run for 2 hours according to the Gen Con schedule, and we can run long, so that's not necessarily a problem for us. So be advised, and if you have a time issue, we're going to try to be very careful to run quickly.
Yeah, we have half hours on the schedule for the panel, so we can go to 12:30.
Yeah. All right, so let me cue this back in. There's the intro screen for the War at Sea Europe, and then Mark, are you gonna do your bit now next? Because I had a couple quick slides. One is to show that the Battle of the Atlantic was pretty much lost by 45. You can see sinkings, and I had a couple things on the U-boats that were coming out, but we'll come back to that if you want to, Mark. So do you want me to shift to yours?
No, I don't have anything on Europe. So
I thought I saw you have stuff for Battle for the North Atlantic.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll continue running off that slide deck that you were just showing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because we really don't have anything else in this one for War on at Sea.
That's right. The war in the North Atlantic was essentially won in the spring of 1942, and a lot of people go into the bravery and whatever. It was, to be cynical, it was won by a reallocation of resources between by agreement between Churchill and Roosevelt. But once the Germans went to war with a U-boat force that wasn't what they wanted it to be. It was essentially evolutionary rather than revolutionary upgrades to their World War I design, and they weren't configured to do what they needed to do. They weren't the best. But Donitz withdrew things from the convoy routes to England and Russia in the spring of '42, and they never really returned. He was waiting for technology and numbers to catch up so he can go re-engage, and that never happened. Toward the end of the war, the Germans put out a handful of new submarines. The only one here that's really particularly important is the Type 21. And Merle, if you could shift to the one slide I'm showing at this point. I'll talk about the Type 21 in a moment. Like in the ground, we'll talk about how the Germans finally got the tanks they wanted, the Panzer IV and Panzer V, too late in the war to help. They finally got the planes they wanted in the Me-262, too late. Well, this is the submarine they actually wanted. This is the Type 21, and she was configured especially for North Atlantic operations. She could make her entire patrol submerged snorkeling. She was faster submerged than on the surface. They built 118, but as far as I know, I think they were too late, a total of 5 war patrols by 3 of them. Two did 3 patrols and 1 each did 1. She was, as a legacy, she was widely studied by the U.S. and the Soviet Union after the war, and they formed the basis of our early Cold War anti-submarine warfare ships. But this is what the war ended up with. And if you look at the hull shape and look at the USS Nautilus, our nuclear power sub, you can see where we got her design from. So anyway, you can go back to the other slideshow, but then Merle. That ship was optimized for endurance and for making convoy attacks. But go on then. Next slide. I don't know how much else we have here. Not much.
So now we're going to hit the war on the ground in Europe. And we're going to start with how the Canadian Army won the war. And that's Michael Tucker, one of our regular staff members and an avid amateur historian, particularly of the history of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah, okay, so my mic's working, right? You can go to the next slide. Merle? Thank you. Step through this slowly because I want to talk as to the points as they come up. So the first Canadian Army, and yes, we did indeed in the Second World War put together an entire army. Next line, please. So the army itself had one corps that was built into the army. Next, which consisted of I wish I should have been driven, but anyways, let's just go. 3 Canadian divisions, 2 infantry, 1 armored. The difference between a Canadian infantry division versus an armored division is that the armored division has an integral armored brigade instead of an infantry brigade. There's also, carry on, Merle. The first Polish armored division spent its entire existence pretty much as part of the first Canadian Army. Next, there's also a separate armored brigade where they would take various armored units and add them as a, for want of a better word, stiffener, extra firepower, whatever you want on various attacks. Next. There was also Canadian Corps that had been fighting, had been temporarily attached to the British 8th Army in Italy from 1943, and a decision was made at a Malta conference in early '45 that that Northwest Europe was going to be the focus of Allied attacks, and so the First Canadian Corps was actually moved to Northwest Europe to join with the First Canadian Army from March 1945. Carry on, Merle. And during this period that we're going to be talking about, the British 30 Corps, yes, the 30 Corps from Market Garden, was attached to the First Canadian Army, and also for quite a while, the First British Corps had been attached to the 1st Canadian Army, and this was not unusual. Next, more. British units attached to the 1st Canadian Army for various operations. Like the 30 Corps was specifically for Veritable, which we'll talk about in a second. The 1st British Corps had been attached through much of its existence after Normandy, and as well, some Canadian units would be attached to the 2nd British Army during Plunder Varsity, which is crossing the Rhine, which happens after Veritable. Next slide, please, Merle. Yeah, thanks. So this is the overall Allied plan for clearing up to the Rhine. The American Operation Grenade is in that green sector down to the south. And then the Canadian-British Veritable, which is also followed by a second part, which doesn't get mentioned, though it's all part of the same thing, Blockbuster. And if you look at the south end of the map, you'll notice that I don't know how well it's going to show on everyone's screen, but you'll notice that the Americans are sitting at a line from the 8th to the 23rd of February. That line on the map is the Rohr River that the Germans, because the Americans failed to get control of the dams that control the flow of that river, they basically opened the floodgates and broke them so that you couldn't stop it. And for that 8th to the 23rd, the river was impassable just because of the flow of water. The initial plan for Veritable was that it was going to kick off on the 8th, and then the American Grenade would actually kick off on the 10th. The fact that Grenade doesn't kick off until the 23rd means that the Germans can focus their resources, because they can see that the Americans can't cross the river. So it's going to slow down and allow them to reinforce, to resist the British Canadian advances. Next slide, please, Merle. Merle. You're one too far ahead, Merle. Thank you. There we go. So Veritable is an operation to clear part of the land up to the Rhine, and it runs over the borders between Holland and Germany. If you look at much of the map, you'll see this sort of black hatched areas on a lot of the map, and that's where basically the Germans have flooded land as a defensive measure. And it is a factor that complicates this whole operation. There's two parts from that. You have the 30 Corps part in the sort of southern half, and then the Canadian Army, the rest of the Army, 2nd Corps is in the northern half of the map. Next slide, please, Merle. So we've got to talk about the weather because it had a major impact on the battle. The thought about kicking off the operation early in March was that the frost would still be in. The winter of 1944-45 was particularly miserable, with lots of rain. The thaw came early, and you can see the results from this shot near the battle area. And in fact, it dictated some choices. That's a Churchill in the background, and the Churchills were chosen when they were available in enough quantity over the Shermans, because the Churchills have a wider track, so less likely, not impossible, but less likely to get stuck. Next, just click to the next, Merle. The most important element that was used in this battle is the Buffalo, which is basically could deal with, because it's an amphib, it could deal with the soggy ground. The Canadians were familiar with them. They'd used them in the operations in clearing the Scheldt in 1944. And the actual vehicles are provided by 79th Armored Division, Hobart's Funnies, and it's one of a number of the critters, as I like to call them, that the Canadians used. So you have Wasps, which are basically universal or Bren gun carriers with a flamethrower. Crocodile, which is a Churchill with a flamethrower, and the other one is the Kangaroo, which was basically an early APC. So basically ram tanks with the turrets off, so that you could get the troops up, protected from indirect artillery fire from fragments. I mean, a direct hit on a APC is always a bad thing, and also machine gun fire, of which the Germans were more than willing to use. Variable pushes on through ugly conditions, flooded ground, but it's helped by German tactics. So the Canadians and others had learned that the Germans love counterattacks. So the basic instruction, whether it's a section, a platoon, company, a battalion, was once you get on your objective, you're going to dig in because there will be an inevitable German counterattack. And it's 1945. Are you, as a German officer, going to refuse a counterattack order? Also, some of the territory they're taking is German territory. And there are many instances of where the Canadians or the British get on their objective and dig in. The German counterattack starts, but because they're ready for it and expecting it, the counterattack is beaten off with heavy casualties. Also, starting in the first part, and then as we get into Blockbuster, you can go to the next slide, Merle. As they get into the Blockbuster operation, they're taking more German prisoners compared to earlier battles in that thing. Blockbuster is just an extension of a veritable, where they're basically cleaning up more of the land so that they can actually cross the Rhine. The Rhine is at the sort of the top right of the picture. You'll notice if you look at this map on the bottom left, you'll see a line of 9th Army's area. And in fact, during this battle, there was a lot of discussion at the highest levels about moving trying to deconflict between the British, Canadians, and the Americans. And that town shown in the extreme right of the picture, Vesser, was an object of contention on who was actually going to take it. And I can't remember now. I'm having a senior moment, as it were. But there was a lot of discussion between at 21st Army Group headquarters about moving that line, and it didn't get there, but eventually they did clear up to the line of the Rhine. Next slide, Mo. The actual assault across the Rhine is not a big Canadian thing. There's some elements of Canadian troops at the divisional level that are temporarily transferred. For the last phase of the war, April to the end, the 1st Canadian Army's task is both to drive north and slightly west to cut off the rest of Holland, the western part of Holland, and also to go up north in Germany and take Emden and perhaps prevent German naval units from coming out of Emden and the Ems Canal that runs through that area. Click, Merle, because I know there's some points that are in here. And at this point, you get the difference from the Canadian perspective of liberation versus occupation. In Holland, the Canadian rules of engagement change so that when they're trying to clear a town, they can't, just basically plaster it with artillery and, ground air support unless they have identified targets to hit. But, and that's obviously, because we're liberating these guys and we don't want to break too much of the stuff. The the other factor that plays in here is that when you're liberating places, the Dutch resistance does help. And you're not worried about partisans behind your back, whereas in the actions going into Germany, there was always a concern. Plus, there was the attitude from the Dutch were ecstatic about being liberated, partly because, and we'll talk about this in relation to Operation Manna and Chowhound, because basically the western part of Holland and anything that was German occupied in Holland had been experiencing what they call the hunger winter, because the Germans were not allowing food to get out to the population. So they were having to do stuff like eat tulip bulbs to survive. And there were a lot of deaths amongst the population. And in fact, only at the very last minute do the Germans, one of whom, the sort of effectively Reichsprotector of the Netherlands, Dr. Seyss-Inquart, talk to the Canadians and tell them, oh, things are sort of bad. Maybe you could help us. And that leads to short-lived Operation Manna, which is the British version, and Chowhound, which is the American version, where they're taking bombers, loading up with food, and then flying at very low altitudes in very specific corridors so the Germans won't shoot at them, and dropping about 11,000 tons of food. Early on, and it only lasts a few days, simply because they can't get enough food in, and preparations are made to actually bring truckloads, like 200 trucks are prepped to bring food into the Netherlands in the event. For the Dutch, Liberation Day for much of the more populous part, that western part, is May 5th. And that's when the German forces surrender to the Canadians, not the British. And the Dutch mark Liberation Day as May 5th, not VE Day. They don't care about that. And for a while, it was every 5 years they would have a thing. And now in the 90s, they made it an annual holiday, like national holiday. And if you were a Canadian veteran and at a Liberation Day event or other events, basically they thought you could literally walk on water. And, there's lots of, there were many marriages of Canadian soldiers and Dutch women. And actually, the Dutch Queen had been in Canada for much of the war after the Dutch government left in 1940. And that's all I think that's all I have, Mo. And
That's
roughly,
right. Thank you so much, Mike.
and just roughly, the casualties from all these operations and occupations, etc., for the Canadian Army was roughly 8,000 during that sort of February to the end of the war.
Anybody have any questions before we move on? Okay, not seeing any. We are going to move on. So we're going to very quickly talk about the Bulge, because our focus is primarily on the last year or so of the war, 45 on. But, the Battle of the Bulge had a significant impact, and we talked about the air war impact with Goering's failed air offensive. But basically, this was a strategic surprise. It was operationally limited success and was rolled back very quickly. We're not really going to talk a lot of details about that, but we wanted to be sure that we had things in context. The other thing about the Bulge was it was terribly cold. It was one of the worst winters in European history, recent history. And these are a couple pictures that I found that were really nice because they've been colorized of the Germans during the advance, an American artillery 155 firing back at the Germans, and then the Allied advance a step later. You know, at this point, we wanted to talk more about the Eastern Front, but our specialist, David, is running behind schedule. But this was just here for context. As you can see, from January to May, the line runs around here in the white. And then by 30 March, basically all of Poland has been overrun. And then by May, you reach Berlin. Now, this is another picture. This is from one of the old Strategy and Tactics magazines, actually, showing how things progressed. Notice that there's a group of Germans still hanging around in Bavaria and towards Austria. That's where they held on for the most part the longest. And you can see the periodic advance. I'm not really going to talk about the specific offensives. The big thing that comes up is the race for Berlin, because you know, Germans attempted to relieve the city and failed. We also have some street fighting pictures in Berlin. And then, of course, the final battle for Berlin, where they cut the city off from the rest of Germany and ultimately moved on the Reichstag. And we couldn't have a lecture without this iconic picture. So we'll move from there. So this is another picture of the final days and the advances. We try to look for different views of these kinds of things so you can see perspective. And of course, the other key issue was, you know, should the Allies or could the Allies have moved quicker? So the next couple issues that we're going to cover are more summary war issues. One of the big ones was Allied logistics. You know, we had a period of time that before the ports in Antwerp and Belgium, both Belgium and the Netherlands were opened up, the U.S. ran a supply line with trucks. And this particular supply line has been made into a couple of movies and a number of articles. But basically, about 97% of the, 75% of the guys that were running the trucks in this were part of black units with white supervisors. And you can see that they basically ran for about 2 months, moved a lot of material. Give me a second here. Let me check my notes on the other screen because I've got some more details about that. There we go. Come on. Come on. There we go. All right. So, oh yeah, here we go. This is the stuff I wanted to be sure to share. We've got nearly a third of the trunks, excuse me, I'm going to slide ahead. My mistake. There we go. Staffed primarily with 75% African-American soldiers. At its peak, it had 5,958 vehicles that carried about 12,500 tons of supplies a day. Ran for 83 days until November the 16th when Antwerp was opened up. French airlines were being repaired and portable gasoline pipelines were deployed about that period as well. And that's why they were able to ultimately discontinue the operation. The other thing that I wanted to cover is the impact of Lend-Lease on the war. A lot of people don't really understand how prodigious the effort was to support our Soviet allies. Nearly a third of the truck strength of the Red Army was built in the United States. Things like the Dodge 3-ton and the Studebaker 2-ton were easily the best trucks available in their class. And we know that the Soviets continued to use them into the 50s and 60s because they were more reliable than many of the Soviet products. You know, American shipments of telephone cable, aluminum, canned rations, and clothing were also critical. I actually met a fellow who was a Ukrainian that had served in the Soviet Army, and he said his first exposure to America was sea rations. You know, that was a really remarkable what we were able to do there. Basically, 17.5 million tons of military equipment, vehicles, industrial supplies, and food were shipped from the Western Hemisphere to the USSR. 94% of that came from the United States. For comparison, 22 million tons landed at Europe to supply American forces from 1942 to 1945. It's been estimated American deliveries through the Persian Gulf alone were sufficient by U.S. Army standards to maintain 60 combat divisions. Really need to think about that. Remarkable. The United States delivered to the Soviet Union from the 1st of October 41 to May 31st, 1945, 427,284 trucks, 13,303 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, 2,328 ordnance vehicles, and 2,670,000 tons of petroleum supplies, or 57% of their high octane fuel. They also shipped almost 4.5 million tons of foodstuffs, meat, sugar, flour, salt, stuff like that. Over 1,900 steam locomotives, 66 diesel locomotives, almost 10,000 flat cars. I mean, it's amazing the kinds of stuff. One item typical was we also sent them an entire tire plant that was lifted bodily from the Red River Complex, River Rouge plant in Michigan that was sent to the USSR. Also, when you read Lotz's books about foreign military equipment being used by the Soviets, he talks about entire divisions and corps equipped with American equipment. The Soviet corps that took Prague was equipped with Shermans. It's absolutely amazing stuff. According to Soviet records, 3,664 M4A2 Shermans were accepted into service between 42 and 45, and about 2,000 of those were the 75 millimeter. It's remarkable what kind of impact this had, because if we had not provided them that kind of support, the U.S. could have fielded, theoretically, with equipment, 91 more divisions, although we might not have been able to draw the manpower. So this is a remarkable issue. And I like to stress it because it is interwoven with everything else that's going on. You can see a couple other pieces here to give you proportions. It shows most of it was munitions and then industrial items by slicing and dicing. What also is interesting is 50% of the stuff we sent them went through the Pacific route, 27% through the Persian route, and 23% via the Arctic. And they figured about 7% of what went through on the northern route was destroyed in transit. The other thing I wanted to hit heavily was the Children's War. As we hit the end of the World War in particular, they were hitting the bottom of the barrel. The Germans finally started recruiting 15-year-olds and putting them directly into the line. The Soviets had been using child soldiers back since 1942, and it's not really clear from the records that we have available in the West how much they were hitting the bottom of the manpower barrel in 45. But I'd be surprised if they weren't hitting the bottom, because we even had problems with the U.S. replacement system. One of the things that's particularly interesting about that was that there were people being sent to the front as replacements in 1945 that had little or no training. There are accounts and diaries and different things from American officers that talk about they got sent guys from the replacement process, and they said, well, can you drive? Have you driven a tractor? Have you driven a truck? And the one guy says, I drove a tractor once, so they made him a Sherman driver. Units that got replacements, they'd have 12 of 17 tanks shot out within 2 weeks after the replacements arrived. And they considered a lot of it was because of the poor training that they were getting. They were just being shipped guys literally after they had the minimal amount of basic training. So that's a critical issue that I want to point out for everybody that we normally don't think about. Oh, the other thing I thought was interesting I did in research, so I did a little vignette on, is what happened to German submarines after the war. And you can see this chart sort of shows where they went. And these were the ones that were not scuttled. So that's just another thing to put things in context, and I'm going to move on quickly here. Some of the what ifs of Europe that
It's
we will try
intriguing.
to end on later is, could the Allies or should the Allies have went for Berlin? And if the A-bomb had been ready sooner, would it have been used in Europe? But we'll hit all that at the very end of the presentation, because now we're ready to move into the Pacific. Okay, this is a basic picture of the Pacific Theater and the progress over the course of 45. Again, here, just as in Europe, the war was essentially won at sea, although we will talk about some sea engagements. You can see the other part of this is Japanese and merchant vessels sunk by United States forces. And you can see very clearly that the American submarine force does not get sufficient credit for the wonderful job that it did. And now I think we're ready to shift to Mark's slides. Is that correct? Okay. Let me take this out, put this in. There we go.
First, I want to recognize that yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the loss of USS Indianapolis. She was sunk by the Japanese submarine I-58 with 2 Type 95 torpedoes. She went down in 12 minutes. We know historically that a ship takes damage. It's either a goner in a few minutes, or it takes a half hour, an hour, 2 hours, and that's a quick decision to make with your damage control if you want to immediately order a abandoned ship. Because if any sailors down in the engine room, any sailors down in the magazine spaces, it takes, especially if they're rushing to get out, it takes minutes to get out of there. So calling abandoned ship, if you can determine quickly that yes, the ship is, we're going to lose this ship, makes a decision whether they're going to live or die. So at any rate, there were 316 survivors out of a crew of 1,195. My math says that tells me that is 889 fatalities, and a lot of those got in the water. But anybody who saw Jaws heard the story of Robert Shaw talking about how the shark just swarmed around them. She had just delivered a little boy to Tinian, so she was on her way back to the Philippine Sea and just ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ship moving that fast is a very difficult target for a submarine of that day to hit, and the I-58 just happened to be in exactly the right spot when she spotted her. So she was doomed at that point. Anyway, that's what I have on Indianapolis. To my eye, she's not the prettiest cruiser, but she was effective, and she was Bruins' flagship at Okinawa, so clearly the staff thought highly of her. Now, we'll talk about, we got asked one question if we could talk about Battle of the Philippine Sea. I don't really want to do that because we talked about that last year. We're talking about 1945 campaigns, but I'll briefly describe because it's the setup. Philippine Sea secured for us down here, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, from which the B-29s would be able to make their attacks on the Japanese home islands. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the naval campaign around there, and that involved actually the Japanese last sorties as a peer adversary to the U.S. They said about a force built around about 9 aircraft carriers. 3 of those were good-sized fleet aircraft carriers. And the Philippine Sea, and the Japanese might have done better if they're better coordinated, but they launched air attacks from multiple directions, uncoordinated. And by that point, we had a fast carrier force at sea that could put 900 planes in the air. So at that point, where our planes were better and our pilots, that the training curve had shifted, our pilots were experienced. The Japanese now were frequently putting rookies out, and we just wiped them out. So the Japanese were left at that point with no whatever carriers they had did not have a core fighting air wing on them after that. So the Japanese at that point were left to surface vessels that engaged Leyte Gulf, and as we'll see in the Okinawa campaign. But to go on now to the Iwo Jima significance, after we secured the bases in Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, from which we were going to start laying waste to Japanese cities, Iwo Jima, which was it was Japanese territory historically, and the Japanese had 2 airfields and building a third on Iwo Jima. That was right in the way. First 2 problems, they would be able to see the B-29s going over and give the Japanese alertment that yes, we should expect them over your home islands in a few hours. That got their air defenses ready. Well, there's a potential for fighter interdiction with the 3 airfields they were going to have. For the Americans, the importance was that it is 560 miles from the Japanese home islands, We could use those as a base from which our long-range fighters like P-51s could escort the B-29s and could be an emergency landing crash site for B-29s coming off that are battle damaged. This is a picture of Iwo Jima, shows B-24s over it. As we see down the lower right-hand side, that's the south end of the island. That's Mount Suribachi, which dominates the terrain, although that's only 554 feet high. So, yeah, a lot of pictures, she looks like a mountain, but she's not. She's really a really, really big hill. Over in the north side, where the B-29 just hit, you can see the puff of smoke. Those are also, it's also rough terrain in the north. It's a central valley in the middle. Over in the north is rough terrain also, and that becomes important to the defense. We flattened Iwo Jima for about 9 months with both air and sea bombardment prior to the invasion. So I talked about this already. Why am I back on that? Okay. This Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, excuse me if I start calling him Kobayashi from the Kobayashi maneuver, but he was in charge, and his perspective was this, that the U.S. is going to try to take this island. They have overwhelming air, sea power, limitless landing forces, and we've been unable to deter them with the huge casualties, so they will take this island. We on our hand have no prospect for resupply. Our Navy can't stop them, or is unable to stop them. We will attribute our support from whole islands. My logistics on the island is already 60% of the standard for our Japanese army about to engage in combat per person. So I'm going to lose this island, and all I can do is to inflict maximum casualties in order to potentially deter the American invasion of the home islands, make them think twice and possibly come to the negotiating table rather than try to take the islands. Okay. The Japanese plan. He saw the defense of Peleliu as a template where they dug these tunnels, interlocking tunnels into the mountainside, and just inflicted huge casualties. Don't try to defend the beach, but do make the beach a killing zone. Strong mutually defensive positions, interlocking fire, artillery, machine guns, things that could, artillery that could open their doors, fire, close them again. And when the air and naval bombardment comes, you can pull away from your openings and then move back in again. No bonsai charges. That is human wave tactics. That's not as a tactical decision. Don't make bonsai charges. But the bonsai charge is really, it's a suicide gesture. It's a way of ending your life honorably when you've done everything else. He didn't have a problem with that, but he did a problem with making human wave infantry attacks before the battle was in fact lost. He built his main defensive zone in the heights to the north, although of course they dug into Suribachi substantially. They had a 17-mile planned tunnel network, of which they completed 11 miles before the invasion. The tunnel actually linking Suribachi to the main forces of the north was never completed. So they ended up with a north and a south force that were isolated and semi-autonomous. From the American perspective, we completely blew how difficult this was going to be. We thought Iwo Jima would fall in a week. We didn't understand the defense preparations. We called the invasion operation detachment, and we started bombarding the Iwo Jima on 15th of June. That was actually Task Force 58, Mitchell's task force. During the Marianas campaign, they took a diversion to attack Iwo Jima. They were worried that some raids could come down from Iwo Jima against the Marianas. So that's part of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the broader Battle of the Philippine Sea. So 9 months was the longest, most intensive bombardment of the Pacific theater. It was done to try to soften up the Iwo Jima. Now, we were unaware of the tunnel systems that they were building, and many of us assumed that the Japanese garrison would be seriously frightened by the bombing raids. Okay. The plan. Our plan was hopelessly optimistic, as many such plans are. For the preliminary naval bombardment, landings with naval gunfire and air support, drive across the island at the narrowest point in the south as 0.8 of a mile, cut it in two, seize the 2 southern airfields that were operating on the first day, then build up forces, clear out the rest of the Japanese ports methodically with heavy air and artillery support. And we thought that was all going to be easy. Now, first, the naval bombardment. Many arguments that continue to crop up between the Marines asking for support from the Navy and claiming they're not getting everything the Navy can give. But there's Major General Harry Schmidt was in command of the landing force. He asked for 10 days of heavy shelling prior to the landings. Rear Admiral Williams H.P. Blandy, Spike Blandy. He's commander of the Amphibious Support Force, and he says, if I shot everything weapon I had for 10 days, we would be out of ammo and couldn't actually do the artillery support when you start land. So he eventually agreed to 3 days. The Marines weren't pleased about that. Now, General Howland M. Smith is Howling Mad Smith, sometimes referred to. He's Harry Smith's boss in the Marine chain of command. And throughout the entire Pacific campaign, he complained about lack of Navy gunfire support, that the Navy wasn't giving the Marines all they potentially could. Okay, so the bombardment started to go bad. On D-3, the 3 days of bombardment, the first day, poor weather led to uncertain results. Probably didn't hit much of anything. Day 2, cruiser Pensacola got too close, and she got hit 6 times by shore batteries. 12 landing craft were trying to land UDT teams. They're underwater demolition teams to start to check for and clear beach obstacles, and they were all hit and left. The destroyer Luther was also hit with 7 fatalities. On D-1, more poor weather affected the bombardment. So questionable impact. The Japanese were dug in and didn't really do much of them. After all, they've been under the same kind of thing for 9 months. It's very, very concentrated now. But General Schmidt's response to this was that he only got 13 hours worth of fire support during 34 hours of available daylight out of the 3 days that Blandy said he was going to get. And meantime, Admiral Misher's Task Force 58, the 5th Fleet Fast Carrier Task Force, arrived the night before the invasion. Big look, the raid was. These fast carriers arrived, but guess what? The Marines said, you were off raiding the home islands when you could have been here supporting the bombardment. And now here you are, we're supposed to be thankful. I also show an inset of the USS New York battleship flying in Iwo Jima. We don't hear much about the battleship New York. She was pre-World War I battleship, spent most of the war in the European theater, and actually came to the Panama Canal 27 November 44. So it's an indication how the naval war was over. She'd been doing convoy duty, how the naval war was really over in Europe by 45. So here she is off Iwo Jima launching her gun. She'd ultimately get sunk by the atomic bomb at Bikini in another year. Iwo Jima, good. First day, the first waves are hitting the beach a minute early, 8:59. You can see Matsurabachi in the background, a lot of the smoke rising from the naval bombardment in support. The planners had misjudged the beaches. They thought the beaches would be excellent and moving inland would be easy. But however, the Marines arrived on the beach, found the 15-foot high berm, soft volcanic ash that they couldn't get secure footing, especially as heavily loaded as they were. It wasn't good for digging foxholes. It was pretty good for absorbing shrapnel. But the Japanese defenders held their fire to let the beaches get crowded. And so we were thinking, yeah, okay, we've been suppressed. We've actually suppressed the Japanese. They're not here. They're not shooting back very hard, blah, 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 blah. So Marines keep getting offloaded on the beach, but they're having trouble moving inshore to getting over that berm in any numbers. The Japanese finally opened fire at 1000, an hour in intense machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery. I show a picture of an Amtrak. The amphibious tractors were very useful in other theaters on other islands, but they were useless in that beach ash. Just churning until the Seabees brought in bulldozers, and under fire they were able to bulldoze some roads into the interior, and that's when the Marines were able to start getting some traction. By the end of the first day, we haven't come near achieving our objectives yet. Down here in the south, the 28th Regiment has pushed through and actually cut across the island, and they've separated Mount Suribachi from the core defensive zones up in the north. We're expecting to seize both airfields on day 1, but in fact we've only got the tip of airfield number 1, and with that's the 27th Regiment. The 25th Regiment has moved in and done good work against some close-in artillery batteries that the Japanese had in the area known as the Quarry. But hunkered down for the night. We'd expect to secure the airfield from the plan, but by the evening we've got 30,000 Marines landed. Helen Smith said to a war correspondent at the end of the day, I don't know who he is, but the Japanese general running the show is one smart bastard. That's a pretty good praise for him. But he's recognizing, he's looked at the casualty figures and recognizing it's going to be a whole lot tougher than we were imagining. As the battle's developing, we land 40 more thousand troops. They take heavy casualties, moving foot by foot, inch by inch. They clear out one Japanese dug-in position only to find that it gets backfilled by troops. So they start shooting at you from behind, or another team's walking up against a position that in an area they thought was secured, to only find that, yes, this pillbox has been reinserted. We found that the flamethrower is a very good weapon, one of the more effective weapons for clearing these things out. And then the Marines ultimately, CVs would come up with bulldozers and close up some of those pits so that the Japanese couldn't use them again. I show the flame-throwing Sherman tank. There were 8 in the inventory. They were particularly useful because the Japanese artillery was situated for indirect fire and not anti-tank weapons weren't big in their arsenal. The naval gunfire support continued, very heavy. There were a lot of guns offshore with a lot of very effective. At this point, they were pretty good at, pretty well trained, including launching star shells at night to keep the areas illuminated to prevent Japanese incursions so that the Marines could see out in front of them, and close air support by the aircraft carrier task force. Of interest, 6 Navajo phone talkers in the first 2 days sent and received 800 messages without an error. Helen Smith said that we couldn't have taken Iwo Jima without those 6. Anyway, with landing area secured, we landed more troops and heavy equipment. The invader proceeded to secure Mount Suribachi and move north to capture the airfield and to secure the island itself. At that point, one kamikaze attack that happened at Iwo Jima took place, an indication of the extent to which the general staff back in Tokyo didn't seem to think Iwo Jima was that important, but they launched one attack. The escort carrier Bismarck C was the last U.S. carrier sunk in the war. I show her here. The escort carriers were interesting. They were built on Liberty ship design, so they were relatively slow, about a little over 10,000 tons displacement. But they were very cheap, very easy to build. We could turn that in large numbers, and any platform they could put 15, 20 combat aircraft to sea was useful. We found uses for them. We found use for them in escorting convoys and in hunter-killer groups in the Atlantic and here in the Pacific. They primarily were operated in close to the coast during these landings for close air support, so keeping the fleet carriers out to sea where they couldn't be targeted easily by Japanese submarines and kamikaze attacks. At any rate, also severe damage to the USS Saratoga. Again, that's like the 3rd time she was severely damaged in the war, but at least this time it wasn't by a submarine. Some more slight damage. I found this picture interesting down the lower right because it looked to me like there was a flaw in the negative, but then I realized that's the cowling of an aircraft on the deck of the Saginaw Bay from which the picture was taken, and that's her propeller. At any rate, I just thought that was interesting. Good. Now we'll talk about the most iconic picture probably of World War II, the raising of Mount Suribachi on the 23rd. This is actually the 2nd time the flag was raised. If you're interested, it's a very complicated story that they go into in Clint Eastwood's movie, Flags of Our Fathers. Joseph Rosenthal took the photo. The first flag raising was by a reconnaissance team from E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. They met light resistance actually climbing Suribachi. The Japanese weren't trying to fight for Suribachi or any part of this island foot by foot. So what they're trying to do is inflict casualties as you walk by. So this team pretty much climbed up, although we hadn't secured Suribachi yet. Take more days for that, but they raised the flag. It was actually a small flag. It was a regimental flag that had been raised over several other sites in the First World War. Now, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal actually landed on the beach at that point. I don't know why the Secretary of the Navy is getting off the beach of an island still being contested, but he's there and he wanted the flag as a souvenir. They weren't about to give it to him, so they substituted the flag. They sent him a larger flag, got a larger pole. These are both raised on Japanese broken water pipes that were just cluttered around as part of the wreckage there. And they raised the second flag. This time was photographed Remarks about the photographs. The only photograph to win a Pulitzer Prize for photography the same year as its publication. As we said, one of the most recognizable images of the war. Possibly the most reproduced photograph of all time. In 1954, Felix de Weldon made a sculpture of it in the Marine Corps War Memorial near Arlington National Cemetery. Now, the 6 men you see here, 3 were killed in action within several days. And it's quite a detective story trying to figure out who these people actually were and who was in the first flag raising. And I think we're not entirely sure still of all the names of all the people involved at what point. You know, from this perspective, one Marine looks like another. Okay. After Suribachi, they slowly moved in, you know, acre by acre, closing these holes, using explosives, using flamethrowers. A lot of defenders were closed up inside, and they dug their way out. So your back was never completely cleared. But eventually, we recorded Suribachi as the focus of action is shifting to the north. Now, in the north is rocky terrain. It's hard to hit with naval supporting gunfire, so it's more difficult to move if you're not getting the same kind of support you did. Suribachi still has a huge force there, and there's hard fighting, heavy casualties. But eventually, over weeks, Japanese ammo depletion, food, water, it made clear that the position was becoming increasingly hopeless. Okay, the U.S. Army Air Force starts to fly Mustangs into, I presume, the Air Base 1 on 6 March. They're launching close air support from the island itself. On 8 March, again, presumably against orders from Kurobayashi, there's a banzai charge ordered by a subordinate of about 1,000 Japanese troops, managed to kill 90 Americans. They counted 784 Japanese bodies at the end of the morning. Also on the 8th, the elements of the 3rd Marine Division reached the northern coast of the island. So now the defenses of the north is split in 2 as well. A couple more weeks pass, and the Japanese are fighting or trying to ambush, and they're also starving, and they're running out of ammo. So on the 25th, a final banzai charge by 300, presumably this was authorized by Kurobayashi, which means, yes, this is a final act of suicide, honorable suicide. The attack was launched toward Airfield 1, lasted 90 minutes, killed 53 U.S. troops, including airmen, Army Air Force airmen operating, keeping service in the P-51s, wounded 20. Now, this is a silent attack. Normally, a banzai charge in previous battles has been a whole bunch of people screaming at the top of their lungs. But this was these people actually followed the defenders rather quietly and got away with some stuff. It was also suggested that maybe there was a more innovative personality running it, and some of the Japanese survivors of this battle said that Kurobayashi himself led the final assault. That's conflicting, but if so, he'd have been the highest-ranking Japanese officer, lieutenant general, after all, 3 stars in our services. To have personally led an attack in World War II. Normally, a Japanese flag officer or a general officer would sit in his bunker, order the attack, and if the attack goes in, he'd kill himself ceremonially. But we don't actually know how Kurobayashi died, and the Japanese letters from Iwo Jima suggest that Kurobayashi in fact shot himself and then was buried. But anyway. Iwo Jima was officially declared secured at 9 o'clock on March 26th. But the fighting always continued. The Army sent in 147th Infantry Regiment to be a, quote, garrison force, unquote, to relieve the Marines. So the Marines could get ready for their next party. But they found themselves in a 3-month fight against defenders who were still in the caves, fighting guerrilla campaign. They killed about over 1,600 soldiers in small unit actions in 3 months. This is on an island that's supposedly secured. Last two defenders to surrender. I'm not going to try to sound those names out, but they surrendered on January 6, 1949. So 3.5 years after the war, they were still hanging out in those cave systems, saying, "I won't give up. I won't give up. I won't give up." Final accounting: 26,000 U.S. casualties, of which 1,600 were killed in action. Was it worth it? I show pictures of the P-51s that are stationed at Northfield and Iwo Jima. You can see Suribachi in the background there. And the
Hey,
B-29.
Mark, we have a question.
Yes.
In your opinion, did the Navy have an easier time in the Atlantic or Pacific at the end of the war? This is from Robert.
I think the Atlantic was a much easier time. As far as the U.S. Navy goes, we're essentially doing convoy escort. Once we got enough aircraft, once we got enough light carriers in to fill those formations, and once we got enough long-range aircraft to close the Greenland air gap, that was it was a rather trivial campaign at the Atlantic from the Navy's perspective. That answer the question? But the Pacific was a bloody campaign, especially when you include the Marines as part of the Navy, because they are. This is one of the toughest fights anybody ever fought. But after it was if you're in part of the carrier force, the naval forces as well, not the Marines, it was almost fun after Midway, because the Japanese couldn't hit. Well, I'd say after Guadalcanal, because once we started to get 15, 20 fast carriers in the core of your force, you're playing a game then. Okay, so B-29s, whatever. I don't think people wanted to say immediately after the war to the people who lost someone in Iwo Jima that the trip wasn't necessary, the fight wasn't necessary. Iwo Jima might have had more value if we actually had to move on to invade the Japanese home islands, but Iwo Jima didn't bring much to the table that Okinawa didn't in terms of the attack. So I'm not sure really if it was ever worth the cost that we paid for it. The immediate justification you see is, oh yes, well, we had to save the B-29 crews coming off the bombing runs. Well, with KIA, 6,800 KIA taking the island, you need a 10-man crew on a B-29. You need to save 680 B-29 crews, and I don't think we came anywhere near that. But on the other hand, I also don't expect that we landed on Iwo Jima expecting to take anywhere near the kind of casualties that we took. So we thought it was going to be easier, and the value we would have would have made it worth it. There's also a psychological effect it would have had on the Japanese, that we just walked in and we crushed this force despite anything. We'll move on to Okinawa now. Okinawa is part of the Ryukyus. The Ryukyu Island chain is southeast of Japan. If you look at this peninsula, that's here, and this is where the Ryukyus go. Okinawa is the largest, heavily populated of the Ryukyu Islands. They're historically owned by the Japanese. The Japanese would say, these are our islands and these are our people, although they would not say that the Okinawans are Japanese, and neither would the Okinawans. But they consider the Okinawans second-class citizens, but still it's a psychological thing about taking an island that the Japanese say is, in fact, an extended part of the Japanese home islands. You can, in some ways, say the Japanese saw that this is where the invasion of the Japanese home islands begins. So this is our staging area. So we thought at this point, certainly we hit this island thinking that we were about to invade Japan in another few months. In terms of that, Japan is 340 miles from Okinawa. It's a staging area of useful fleet anchorage in the south, well-developed troop staging areas, airfields, and will be a valuable logistics hub for invading the southern islands. The invasion force, we assembled a 10th Army of combined U.S. infantry and Marine divisions, their own tactical joint Army and Marine Air Force with their combined naval and air forces. About 103,000 Army personnel, 88,000 Navy, and 88,000 Marines, 18,000 Navy. I'm calling people Navy people who are going ashore. That's mostly CBs, construction battalion, and medical people. The Navy provides the medical services for the Marines. If you want to be a doctor in the Marines, you have to join the Navy and be a doctor in the Navy. So when a Marine screams corpsman, it's the Navy corpsman going to be running up to him. So about 182,000 personnel total. I know those don't add up. There are different sources I use, and I haven't tried to resolve them. But you get the idea that we're close to 200,000 people who are planning to come ashore to invade Okinawa. The Japanese had about 67,000 troops of the 32nd Army. There are additionally about 8,000 Navy troops. Most of them aren't equipped for combat. They conscripted Okinawans, about 39,000 hastily drafted. They're not well trained, not well equipped, and their degree of commitment is questionable. Presumably, some of them saw themselves as, yes, I am part of the Japanese Empire, and this is the island I'm going to defend. There was also a lot of propaganda that the Americans are going to come in here and rape, kill, pillage, and burn. And a lot of the Okinawans believed that, to the point where a lot of them committed suicide. Civilians committed suicide rather than get captured by the Americans, or the Americans about to overrun their village. Their primary resistance was in the south. They were going to be building their primary defensive fortifications. Their general was Lieutenant General Ushishima. Their chief of staff was a Lieutenant General Chao. Chief of operations was a Colonel Yahara. Yahara wanted a defensive strategy, while Chao wanted to advocate the offensive one, considering that they felt they would be outnumbered 3-1, and in firepower close to 10-1. They knew that an offensive operation generally wasn't going to be possible. Now in the north, there's a Colonel Udo was put in command there, and that was by comparison a token force. Inscription. This is one slide I could put of many, but I knew we were going to be running out of time. The Japanese army mobilized about 1780 is what the records show. Middle school boys aged 15 to 17 for years old in frontline service. They were on paper volunteers. They weren't really military authorities. Japanese ordered secondary schools to force almost all students to volunteer. And about 2,000 soldiers would die as a result of that. I know those numbers also don't match, different sources. Female students were brought in, conscripted, mainly to act as nurses, but that exposed them to fire as well, and a lot of them, suffered and died. So it was one of many things that were said or alleged about Japanese mistreatment of the Okinawans during the war. I'm not going to arguments and recriminations go back and forth today. I'm not going to go into any greater detail with it, but that's one of the first thing I'll mention. Now, the Okinawa landings took place on April 1st. It was relatively easy originally. Remember, the Japanese were not trying to defend the beach at this point. They'd learned their lesson that beach defenses are rather thin shells. Overall, they'll do more damage with a defense in depth strategy inland, where they could really dig in. It was the largest amphibious assault in World War II. As you can see, the landings were here in the center, the intention being to secure two airfields that drive north and south to secure the rest of the island. Now, something called Operation Tengo is worth mentioning. On April 6th, there was a sortie of 10 Japanese warships built around the super battleship Yamato. That was the largest battleship ever built, and the survivor, her sister ship Musashi, was sunk at Leyte Gulf on October 25th last year. And the intent was to get the ships, especially Yamato, into the American naval formation and start whaling away. I think they saw Admiral Kurita got his force, including at that point Yamato, at Leyte Gulf, within firing range of the American forces supporting the landing, but he got spooked. He turned around and left. I think they saw that as a mistake, and Yamato was going to go for it again, see if they can get in the same position. She was supposed to do as much damage as she could to the American formations before beaching herself, and then acting as an unsinkable, undestroyable artillery platform, while the crewmen that were unneeded to keep the guns firing would form naval infantry and go ashore. She did not have fuel to come back. Unfortunately for them, they were spotted by U.S. submarines Threadfin and Hacklebeck shortly after leaving home waters, and they were attacked on the 7th with 300 U.S. carrier aircraft. The Spruance force, Admiral Spruance, had gotten 6 battleships ready to go face the Yamato. That would have been an interesting gunfight. I assume those are the 6 fast battleships, South Dakota, Washington, or Iowa classes, in which case I would have strongly bet on the U.S. 6 battleships and the Japanese 1 super battleship. But the easier thing they found was to launch carrier aircraft. That's after all what we have, aircraft carriers. And they launched about 300 air carriers and 2 waves that attacked for over 2 hours. They sank the Yamato. You could see her picture. I'm told that this plume could be seen, ultimately climbed to about 40,000 feet and could be seen for 120 miles. Also, the light cruiser Yahagi and four of the 8 destroyers. The Japanese lost 3,700 sailors, to which we lost 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. And that was the last gasp, essentially, of the Japanese Navy in the war. Now, but that was concurrent with the beginning of the kamikaze campaign. The Japanese didn't release the kamikazes until April 6th, the same day that Yamato is sortying. They attacked with 400 planes from Kyushu. By the 22nd, over the next 2.5 months, they will launch 1,400 aircraft in large-scale sorties, 180 individual sorties from Kyushu, 250 from Formosa, where there weren't supposed to be 250 aircraft by our intel. They sank 20 American ships and 157 were damaged. Most of the ships they hit that damaged, they were small ships, the radar picket destroyers, landing ship tanks, or whatever. What they often a poorly trained kamikaze pilot who might have a few hours stick time will dive on the first thing he sees. But some large ships were hit, including the carriers Bunker Hill and Franklin, as you can see below, and the British carrier Formidable. The Bunker Hill and Franklin, both Essex-class carriers, they made it back. They made it back to port. They were, in theory, put back into service, but they were left in the reserves, and they never saw operational status again. They were the only Essex-class carriers of the 26 we made that didn't have a Cold War career as doing something. They were kept in reserve. Formidable, she had an armored flight deck. Our Essex were not those armored flight decks. We needed the space and weight to put the more planes on. We made a different strategic choice. But Formidable was back in operation in 50 minutes. Very, very impressive. Now, here's the landing plan. We've got the primary landings at Kadena and Yehota airfields were made fairly easily and quickly, and they were in fact so quick and easy that it gave us the confidence to try to push on. So let me get my script up here. Okay, hold on.
So Mark, when you get to your Hiroshima slide, I want to break because I want to circle around for David to do his brief bit on the race for Berlin. And then we'll come back to your Hiroshima slides, and then Ryan will talk about some other interesting facts about the bombing after you hit your first slide or two.
Okay, sounds good. Anyway, after a substantial initial success taking the central part of the island, General Geiger, Lieutenant General Geiger, released the Marines to head north, to take the north side of the island, and the U.S. Army to move south. The Marines moved rather quickly through relatively light opposition and reached, after the first week, they sealed off this Motabu Peninsula, where there was, again, very heavily wooded and good defensive terrain. Where they continued to move north and reached another week, reached the north side of the island. And they took them another week or so to actually move in and close off this peninsula. In the meantime, a lot of the Marines were freed up to go support the army in the south, where they quickly started to run into the serious bulk of the Japanese resistance called the Shuri Castle line. Shuri, the village of Shuri here is the Shuri Castle. It's an ancient castle, isn't actually part of the defensive line, but the entire series of defensive depth through here became known as the Shuri Castle line. There was a lot of heavy fighting there. The Marines ended up taking the right flank and the army to the left. That didn't please the Marines. They thought they'd fought their battle and won up in the north, and that they were being called in and put into risk again because the army just can't hack it. That's the kind of thing Marines say. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the numbers, the Marines had a relatively easy fight in the north, and the U.S. Army ran into the bulk of the resistance in the south. So the Japanese 32nd Army counterattacked they tried to counterattack on the nights of 12th, 13th, 14th, of April down in this area. You can see these little arrows in a slightly different color. I don't know if that's coming through well, but what they learned is that yes, infiltration tactics at night, the Americans are vulnerable, But in fact, if we concentrate our forces, the overwhelming American firepower starts to tear us apart. So they fell back on a defensive strategy again to try to continue to fight the attackers and inflict casualties. So they tried a second counterattack on May 4th, which also failed. They apparently tried to amphibious envelopments. I don't know how that worked, but I think they were probably small boats just trying to steam at night. But they quickly fell back. So over these weeks, the U.S. forces on the Marines on the right and the Army on the left were inching forward with heavy casualties. By the 11th, 11 May, we launched a heavy attack with 10 days of heavy fighting, the most heavy naval bombardment in the war to support that. The Army secured a position called Conical Hill in the east, and the Marines Sugarloaf Hill on the west, and that's beginning to envelop the Shuri Castle core defenses. Lieutenant General Geiger in charge is actually helping and enveloping the formation and trapping the pocket of the 32nd Army. But in fact, the Japanese do at that point withdraw to primarily positions down here around Iloman, I guess that is. And there's also a pocket up here near Naha, which we in fact envelop with an amphibious assault on June 4th, destroy that. So Shuri Castle actually falls on May 29th. Most of the Japanese have left, executed withdrawal. By June 17th, the remnants of the 32nd Army are in the small pocket south in Iliwan, down here. Okay. Now I talked about General Buckner is an overall command. He is Lieutenant General. He's killed by artillery fire while monitoring progress from a forward observation post. I identified General Geiger as Lieutenant General. I'm sorry, he was a Major General. General Geiger is the highest-ranking U.S. officer lost enemy fire during World War II. That's a 3-star. He's replaced by Roy Geiger, Major General, Marine. That makes Geiger the only U.S. Marine to ever command a numbered army of the U.S. Army in combat. But Vinegar Joe Stilwell will relieve him 5 days later. I think they flew him out from the Pentagon to say we need somebody with 3 or 4 stars to take over here. I'm surprised they didn't have anybody in their back pocket in Pearl Harbor. But Stilwell at that point was in Washington. So he died down here. That's him. That's him here. The day he was killed. The end game in Okinawa, the last of the Japanese resistance ended on June 21st. The general and his chief of staff were committed suicide, seppuku, in their command headquarters. Colonel Yahara, the officer, he asked for permission to commit suicide, but the general told him somebody had to survive and ordered him, as your commanding officer, I'm ordering you to swallow your pride and survive to tell what happened. Yahara is the most senior officer to survive the Battle of Okinawa and later authored a book, The Battle of Okinawa, which is it does a fine job of giving the Japanese high-level perspective. Some Japanese continued in hiding. An official surrender ceremony took place on September 7th near Kadena Airfield. Notably, that's 5 days after the official whole Japan surrender. The cost casualty estimates vary. The Okinawans have a peace memorial museum at the Okinawa Prefecture where they have actual names, 200,000+ names, but they list the names of 149,000 Okinawan civilians. Now, that sounds like a lot. It's about half what the expected population, the estimated population at the beginning of the war was. But that also, when you try to look at their counting, they're listing everybody that was killed by Japanese action from the moves into Manchuria before Pearl Harbor, before World War II broke out, throughout the end of the war. Imperial Japanese soldiers listing about 77,000, American soldiers, sailors, and Marines 14,000. And a number of people, Koreans, the United Kingdom probably on the various warships that were hit, but Koreans and Taiwanese were probably brought in as labor. Also, Brigadier General Easley was killed by a machine gun fire. Another general we lost. And the war correspondent Ernley Pyle was killed by machine gun fire on Ill Island, or Ilijima. That was off northwestern Okinawa as part of the extended campaign to take that position. U.S. losses by breakdown, and here I want to point out that the Navy lost more people than the Army or the Marine Corps at 4,900. When you ram kamikazes into 157 ships, that's the kind of thing you're going to get. Now, certainly we also lost a lot of Navy corpsmen and Seabees as well. And the Marines, as much as they complained about how they were doing the job for the Army, lost fewer people than the Army did. We lost 36 ships and 768 aircraft. The Japanese losses largely estimates, but about 110,000 KIA, including the Okinawan conscripts, 16 ships, and 1,400 aircraft. Or I expect it's got to be more than that, because it's also included. We know there are at least 1,400 kamikazes. Okay, the Japanese losses. Additionally, Japanese surrenders. Japanese and Okinawans together, including some that surrender over the next few months, brought the total surrenders to 16,000. That was the first battle of the Pacific War in which the thousands of Japanese soldiers were surrendered or were captured. And usually they fought to the death. And a battle like this, we'd have a few hundred prisoners, maybe. And I wonder if this might suggest that Japan herself was nearer to surrender than popular opinion holds. I know they put on a face of bravado and we will fight to the death. But when it comes down to it, after it's clear that the war objectives are not going to be met, is a time for them to give up. The impact, sizable U.S. losses to take the island, but we also were staggered by the enormous loss in the civilian population. 30 to 50% of the island depopulated. Huge losses were inflicted also on the Japanese. How many of these people do we have to kill, and is there a way to not kill them and still win the war? Together, following the Marianas campaign in Iwo Jima, this left us with perceptions of a bitter and destructive potential invasion of Japan. How many Japanese are going to die? How many people are we going to lose? And that would affect the thought process that led to the decision to use the atomic bomb. As far as ways where we're at, post-Okinawa, how do we win the war now? Well, the war is won, just that the Japanese don't know it yet.
Mark, you advance your slide?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong thing. These are the total numbers. That's the breakdown. Again, more Navy lost more than the Army, lost more than the Air Force, and the Japanese losses were huge. And this shows the surrenders, the POW camps, and some of the devastation of you see in Japan, the islands. And these are actually two conscripted soldiers were trying to get back, trying to rejoin life, and Okinawan refugees. So the war is won. The Japanese just don't know it yet. The Army says the next step is invade and conquer the Japanese islands. Conflicting casualty estimates, both what casualty we'll take and the civilians. Navy says, okay, the answer now is you just ring the Japanese islands with steel. Our ships, our mines, we could send 90% of the troops home. And the rest of the world can go back to peace and wait for the Japanese to see reason, even if it takes 10 years. Now, I know Matt said that they'll start by November 1945, but the Japanese had proven a willingness to start. Okay, the Army Air Force says the answer, as Matt was pointing out, is just keep bombing until they see reason. Okay, do we want to stop here and let Ryan talk, or want me to go through this firebombing? I know Matt talked.
Go ahead and do the firebombing, end with your picture slide, and then we'll circle back for 2 slides on the ground war in Asia, and then go back to the final thrust on Europe and finish with Ryan and your slides on the bombings.
Okay. A firebombing of Tokyo night raid on 9 to 10 March was the single most destructive bombing raid in human history. About 60,000 square miles of we destroyed that one night, 100,000 civilians dead, and over a million homeless. Cut the city's industrial output in half. And some post-war analysts say it was a war crime. I know we didn't do anything like this to the Germans. We thought we did something like this at Dresden in the firestorm. We stopped area bombing because of it. Firebombing raid on the 26th. This was the later raid on Tokyo. This is Tokyo after the war. So it shows you the kind of things we were doing to these Japanese cities. You don't see this kind of devastation in Europe, probably because the Europeans don't make a lot of their houses out of paper. But anyway, so Hiroshima bombing. Now we break or continue? Merle, do we break now?
Yes. I'm going to add 2 slides for the Asia, and then we're going to circle back to Europe. And then we'll come back for the Hiroshima stuff and Ryan's slide, because he has a number of interesting things about the actual decision to drop the bomb. So the 2 things I wanted to highlight here with these 2 slides that you're going to see, one is where the war on the ground was basically at the height in China, because people often don't think about this. And, the real activity in China is sort of low key, except for the Japanese offensive that happens in 44. But, there's a tremendous amount of territory and a tremendous amount of the Japanese army that's tied up. What we discovered with research is that towards the very end, in the last couple months of the war, only about 30% of the Japanese army was in Japan. Okay. And the bulk of the Japanese army was tied up in this kind of stuff. What they also did is, when you look at the map, the strongest units are on the front. So these guys back here in like Manchuria are sort of the second stringers. And that's an important thing, because of the next slide I want to show you, which is something we don't often talk about because there's not a lot of source material written in English, which is Manchuria. Basically, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria had been planned since the end of the war in Europe as part of the agreement between Roosevelt and Stalin. And what's interesting is this is an area about the size of Western Europe. And they basically overrun it in no time flat. I've had some difficulty finding actual timelines for some of this stuff, but you've got about 1.5 million Soviets against 1 million Japanese. But when you get into Manchuria, they have only one really significant battle, and that battle is in and around Harbin, where they've got about 80,000 Japanese against about 340,000 Red Army troops. So what's interesting is you can see the distinct difference with this last slide, because over on this side on the left, you see this is the Japanese army as they were doing maneuvers on the Amur in August of 45. Notice that's all donkeys and stuff. There's almost no motorized transport like we think of in Europe, and they're all infantry. When you look at the Soviet troops, they're all in nice uniforms. These were hand-picked guys because they took the best units from Europe, and they overran this place in no time flat. The one significant reference we have on it was written by Colonel Glantz before he left the military, and Colonel Glantz is one of the guys that has lectured with us at Origins. So I wanted to be sure that you all had a picture of that. So now what I want to do is shift back to Europe, and we're going to go back to the movement and race for Berlin. Okay, so this were the final days, and I'm going to let David pick up from here.
Yeah, so one thing I can say right off the bat for the Soviets, in Soviet Russia, we raised flag once.
David, you're cutting in and out.
Sorry.
Yeah, try to get closer to your mic.
I'm wondering, let me check on mic here, because sometimes every unit I have.
We are not hearing you, David.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Because it was set to my wrong mic. It sometimes defaults to my computer for stupid reasons. Okay. So I was just saying, in Soviet Russia, we raised flag once. We don't have to do it a second time. And if we did, we would have shot the first guy, so no one would know that we had to do it a second time. So, yeah. So the Stalin was very concerned by the end that the Americans would not honor the terms of what happened at Yalta in the divisions of Eastern Europe. So he decided to put all the pressure on getting into to Berlin before the Americans do or the British do. So he concentrates all 3 fronts. He's got 2 fronts, and he's got, it turns out, Königsberg falls really late into the offensive, so they can get in a 3rd front from Rossakowski, who is famous for overrunning the army back at Stalingrad. So you got two I shouldn't say major generals. There's two field marshals in the Soviet army that are vying for Stalin's attention. One is Konev, who's in the south, and Zhukov, who's in the north. And Stalin's playing off of both of them. And he basically sets down a term to tell both of them they have to race for it so that they will proper communist. He's using competition instead of a communal front. Just a little joke there. So he's sends those two generals off to do that. I did learn something interesting recently. There's not much documentation in support of this. Unfortunately, it's recently declassified stuff. But apparently, there was talk of doing a small offensive to get to Berlin by the Americans. They were staging at Magdeburg. The lieutenant general there, who was there, proposes up to Bradley and then up to Eisenhower that he would send the 2nd Armored and the 83rd Infantry Division, which was by then motorized with a whole bunch of captured German equipment. And he was going to send them down a highway and try to get to as close to Berlin as they could. And they decided in the end, it was just too risky an operation because they had it was like send them down the highway, no flanks, just hoping that the Germans would surrender. And they would not surrender to the Russians for another couple weeks. But that was a plan. Eisenhower kiboshes it, not wanting to risk anyone on such a harebrained scheme. But he, in later years, of course, regrets it, coming to the conclusion that it would have been better for the post-war settlement to get as far into Germany as possible, as we now know. But it worked out in the end, so that was good for us. The Germans are Himmler, for some reason, ends up near the end of the war getting a lot of titles forced upon him, but some of the general staff manages to convince Hitler that you don't want a political guy actually commanding a field army against the Soviets, and they bring in who is it here? They bring in Manteuffel and Heinrici. Heinrici is considered one of the best defensive generals of the war for any side. He's placed in charge of Army Group Vistula. It is important to note, even at this late stage in April, when everything is falling to pieces, Hitler is ordering a counteroffensive, trying to get 3 of his last armor divisions to try to get to Budapest, because that's where the last of the oil is. But they just they spend like 3 weeks fighting here in Berlin, trying to get into it. So do we have the next slide? Yeah, so you can see what's going on here. You got the different fronts. There's attempts to they come in and they break up the different army groups, and they're driving in. There's attempts to relieve the city all throughout April and May. So the hope was, as I said earlier, you got Magdeburg down there, and the hope was to drive those 2 divisions to Potsdam, and but of course that didn't happen. So you got these 3 big, the first Belarusian front and the second Ukrainian front just crushing in there. It is, however, pretty intense fighting, as like the SS are brought in. There's old men in the 40,000 men in the Volkssturm, and it's just coming down to very much the end of the war. And we can go to the next slide, I guess. Yeah, so it's just brutal fighting there. It's my father served in the army, the Air Force, for the Canadian Armed Air Forces during the 1950s, and he said, he remarked to one of his German friends when he was visiting Berlin and other cities. He said, "So your cities are so remarkably clean and nice and wide boulevards," and like, yeah, because you spent 7 years smashing all our cities. So it was really easy for us to clean it up. So here you got like a Panzer, I think, self-propelled gun fighting it out in the street. And yeah, that's it. The final 3 fronts are right there, isolating the city and just encircling it. So Konev's coming up from the south, Zhukov in the center, and then I think it's the second Belarusian is Rosakovsky coming in, and you just got 3 huge armies smashing down on the last 100,000 men the Germans seem to have. And yep, just the final push to get the Reichstag flag, their flag over the Reichstag, and pretty much an end of the war. And yep, a nice flag picture for you. Hitler, I believe, commits suicide in his bunker. The war technically goes on for a couple more weeks after Hitler dies, when the only other Reichschancellor, the head of the Navy, whose name is escaping me right now, is gets put in command.
Donitz.
Was that?
Donitz.
Yeah, and he's just gets he has enough time to basically surrender the entire country after getting all the reports on how just badly it is, and it's like, why didn't we surrender weeks ago, kind of situation. He does have interesting impact on the war. He wants to keep the.
Thank you.
He kept. What's that?
Oh, no,
He had.
I didn't realize you weren't done.
Okay, I'm just going to point out, yeah, so Donetsk, if the army, he has an army group trapped in the Memeland, defending the Type 21 subs that he had promised Hitler would win the war for him. And of course, they were revolutionary design for subs, went on to be the basis for the Hunt for Red October movie. But in the end, that those troops that were stuck protecting his sub pens could have been better used defending Berlin. Anyways, yeah, that's my conclusion.
Okay, thanks, David. Now what I'm going to do is shift to Mark's slide deck for a second. He has a couple of things on Hiroshima, and then we're going to go to Ryan's analysis and some of the information he's uncovered.
Okay, Hiroshima bombing August 6th, 1945. About 13,000 kilotons, sometimes 15. Growing up, I was always told it was 20 kilotons. I think it was propaganda. But when the numbers were actually released, the flash was measured by one of the trailing bombers, and that gives us the actual measurement. Casualty numbers are all estimates, about 80,000 immediate or short term. I know Matt's slide said 66 to 78. I'll go by his, probably right, but maybe twice of that in the hours or months that followed. From injuries, burns, and radiation, possibly long-term over the years, 3 times as many. Nagasaki was not as bad, mostly because the bomb missed the center target area, bigger yield though. I asked, would we have done this kind of thing to the Germans? Maybe we would have, but I'm just asking. Okay, would we have done this?
I think it would have depended. I think you would have done it in 44, but maybe not in 45.
But they were wringing our hands about the use of the atomic bomb in Japan. Our stated reason at the time and up to today is that we avoided the need to invade Japan. That would involve huge U.S. and allied casualties. More Japanese would die as a result of the invasion than by the bomb. It's time to get the war over and bring the boys home. The Japanese are defeated. We need to convince them of that. There's no reason why we should be keeping 9 million men mobilized away from their wives and sweethearts and parents. And no reason why we need to spend the money to move millions of troops from the European theater to Japan to start doing this. No reason we need to keep killing Japanese by the scores of thousands in B-29 raids. No reason we need to continue the destruction of all Japanese cities. We need to finish this. Today, of course, our detractors are accusing us of a racist mentality, that we didn't care how many of those people, those little yellow people who bombed Pearl Harbor, we didn't care how many of them we killed, or we didn't think they were humans anyway, the only good Jap is dead Jap, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also that we needed to demonstrate the power of this new weapon to the Soviets. Japan was just this convenient people that we got to kill as many as we want to, and nobody complained about it. So anyway, that's the question, the reasons why. And
I'd like to, if I could just interject. I just want to point out that I've read the casualty figures for the U.S. and British invasion. It's going to be 200. The estimated casualties are 250,000 U.S. dead, 2 million wounded, and the Japanese casualties were estimated to 2 to 7 million. And the plan called for the use of about a dozen nuclear bombs.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wouldn't have had a dozen nuclear bombs.
I've got some issues with that.
Okay.
I'm covering
And we
those
also
in
have
my
a couple
slides.
slides on Coronet and Olympic that we can close out with as well to talk about the what if, because that was an ugly what if.
Okay, so I guess this is Ryan now.
Yeah, what we're going to do is I'm going to shift to the other screen. So give me a second. I'm queuing up his slides.
Guys are over time, so if anybody has to leave, I appreciate your coming. And again, if you haven't submitted your tickets yet, we need to get credit for it by Gen Con, so please do so. And you can do that ahead of time. So I'm going to go to mute now, and I'm still here.
Okay, Ryan.
Okay. Well, first off, I wanted to go back a little bit and talk quickly about the Nagasaki bombing, because the Hiroshima bombing basically went completely according to plan. Nothing went wrong. The Nagasaki bombing, I'm actually kind of surprised there wasn't a court-martial, because what was stenciled on the nose of the bomb was JANCFU, Joint Army Navy Civilian F up. And that's exactly what happened. Major Sweeney, who was in charge of the flight, took off from Tinian, but he realized before taking off, they realized they had a problem, that one of the fuel pumps for the auxiliary fuel tank they couldn't get it to work, so 700 or 640 gallons of gas was completely unusable, but it couldn't be offloaded, and it was contributing dead weight to the plane and would make the plane take longer, take more fuel. But they really didn't have a choice. They couldn't exactly offload Fat Man onto a different plane, so they decided to go.
Was control of air security required for these Boeing missions, and if so, how was it achieved? And I'll sort of take a shot at this and let you fill in. And the answer is yeah, because you don't want the plane with the one of two atomic bombs to go down. But we had achieved air superiority really long before that.
The few bombs we had were so important that yes, I wouldn't have wanted to lose the bomber carrying one either. Now remember, the B-29 was built to make its attacks at close to 30,000 feet, and the 509's composite group was built especially to drive up to 32,000. Most of the bombing took place in Europe was 18 to 22,000 yards, so 20,000 feet high. They were above where most artillery could hit, and the Japanese air defenses had been largely neutralized at that point. So yeah, if this had been, if there had still been a sizable Japanese air defense, I would have said, yeah, go send the plane in and cluster with P-51s, and tell the P-51 pilots, get the hell out of there when they tell you that bomb's going to be released. Because the piston engine plane surviving a nuclear attack that it made is problematic.
Yeah, and I want to circle back to Robert's question about Iwo Jima and Okinawa. When the planners were considering the value of Iwo Jima and Okinawa landings, did they know we were developing the bomb, and was it part of a ruse to keep them off balance?
I would say at that point.
Go ahead, Rob.
First off, the design of the bomb and the fact that it was being worked on was basically need to know at pretty high levels. And so the idea that we were somehow banking on it as an ace in the sleeve. The other thing, too, is that it wasn't even certain that the bomb would work. It wasn't until July of 45 that we knew that a plutonium implosion bomb could work. Now, there's two types: the uranium little boy bomb, and that is limited because of producing enriched uranium using the technology available at the time was ridiculously inefficient. We only were able to produce enough for one bomb. We didn't have enough for another.
It's worth pointing out that 4 of the first 5 nuclear weapons ever detonated were the Fat Man type, the Fat Man design. The 2 at Bikini.
Yeah, plutonium could be produced in a nuclear reactor, so we could just build as many reactors as we want and churn out as much plutonium as we want. The problem, though, is no one was sure whether or not it could be detonated and whether or not the implosion system of that type of bomb would actually work. And it wasn't really until July of 45 that Trinity happened that people were sure. So I find it really unlikely that we would have banked on it as a war-winning strategy. And even if we had, our ability to produce these bombs and churn them out in bulk was very limited. By August of 45, we only had 2 plutonium bombs, one detonated in New Mexico as a test, and the 1 uranium bomb, and that was it. So back to Nagasaki. As I said, everything that could go wrong did. Now, in order to minimize air defense, they only sent out 3 B-29s. They did not send out fighter escorts. They required them to maintain radio silence, which becomes critical because they were supposed to meet up. There was the strike plane, there was an instrumentation plane, and there was a photography plane. And the instrumentation plane showed up. The photography plane was circling in the wrong pattern at the wrong altitude. Tibbets ordered Sweeney to wait 15 minutes and move on because they were low on gas. Sweeney waited 40 minutes, still didn't see them, and then went on to the primary target, which happened to be Kokura. And now, meanwhile, at Kokura, the Enola Gay had been there first to do weather observations. Weather was clear then, but there's actually some interesting report from a U.S. POW camp that when B-29s were spotted, the power plant would divert its steam into the river to create fog. That's an interesting theory. It's also a city nearby had been firebombed the night before, and the smoke was drifting over. But they did 3 bombing runs, wasted around 50 minutes, and they were not able to get a visual on the target. And this is another important point, is that they were under strict orders to do a visual bomb run. And the reason for that is because that way you couldn't be confused about ambiguous radar signatures and bomb the wrong thing. This is supposed to be a powerful stroke of force, a shock and awe weapon on the US's part. Imagine what would happen if we dropped a nuke outside the city. It singed the edge and vaporized 100 head of cattle. That's going to scream incompetence to the Japanese, not you need to be surrendering now. So they were under absolute orders to do a visual bomb because they could not miss. And after 3 attempts that failed at Kokura, they decided to proceed to their secondary target, which was Nagasaki, which was actually added as a handwritten addendum on the draft of the original bombing order. And they then realized that they had a huge problem because they would not have enough gas to get the plane, and they didn't have enough gas to return to Tinian. They were planning on going to Okinawa to land there and refuel. And they weren't even sure if they had enough gas to do that, especially if the bomb was on board. And another source that I found was that there was an order not to return with the bomb. The concern is that it's a sphere of plutonium with a whole lot of high explosive around it, and it's not safe by modern nuclear standards. And there was a concern if the plane were to crash and that high explosive were to go off, it wouldn't produce a 20 kiloton yield, but it might produce a several ton nuclear fizzle. And you could nuke Okinawa or Tinian by accident, and that would have been catastrophic. So the orders were to ditch the bomb in the Pacific if you couldn't drop it on the target visually. So this produced a lot of stress on them. And they lined up, they had 1 shot to make a bombing run into Nagasaki, and it was cloudy. And they weren't even sure if they could do it. They missed the primary aiming point. They found the secondary aiming point. They successfully released it and went on. By the time they got home to Okinawa, one of their engines was out of gas and cut out right as they were landing. They couldn't even get the control tower on the radio, so they were firing all of their flares to basically say, you other aircraft, get the heck out of the way. We're coming in now to this runway. We don't care. And the plane nearly hit a bunch of other B-29s when they could barely stop it. It was coming in too fast. So just about everything that went wrong did on that mission. Nagasaki was also a very suboptimal target. there were deep valleys, and there were basically, it was divided up by valleys, which actually contained the blast damage. And it had also been bombed several times before. Normally, the target committee went to LeMay, and LeMay was a butcher. He was going at it. He was going at it with the goal of making sure that no two stones stood on top of each other anywhere in Japan. And he was taking out cities right and left. And they were worried that LeMay would finish leveling Japan by the time the bomb was ready. And so they actually had to say, hey, you need to reserve a few cities so that we would have a clean slate to demonstrate this bomb. And that did happen. Nagasaki was not one of them, and it had been bombed a couple times before. So let's go back to my slides. The first question I wanted to address is who made the decision to drop the bomb? And everyone assumes, oh, it was Truman, it's the president. We've got so much theater around command and control of nukes that only the president can launch. We've got the nuclear football and that follows the president around everywhere. And it's just ingrained in the US psyche that it's a presidential decision. But at the time, the bomb was basically just another weapon in the US arsenal. It didn't have the mythic importance that we ascribe to nukes today. Next slide. So this right here is the actual order to drop the bomb. It was not made by Truman. Truman was at Potsdam at the time, and it was made by the authority of War Secretary Stimson and Chief of Staff Marshall. It named 4 targets, Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagata, and Nagasaki. And it said that the start of the bombing was to begin on August 3rd, which was one day after the Potsdam Conference ended, and that additional bombs would be dropped, would be delivered on above targets as soon as made ready by the project staff. So that was the order. Now, Truman, of course, knew it was happening. It was not a surprise. He knew Hiroshima was happening. He could have said no, but he didn't, and he never said yes. So this idea of Truman sitting at his desk agonizing over whether to sign an atomic bombing order never happened. It was made by lower level people, and he approved it effectively by inaction. Next slide. So I covered that. Next slide. So while Truman didn't decide to bomb, he did decide to stop the bombing. And the Nagasaki bombing, it happening 3 days after Hiroshima, was actually very suboptimal because it didn't give the Japanese enough time to investigate the damage of Hiroshima and come to any kind of response. But the reason that this occurred, it was all due to weather delays. The Hiroshima bombing was delayed from the 3rd to the 6th, and the Kokura bombing was pushed forward because bad weather was predicted on the 11th, and the bomb was ready on the 9th. And from what I have heard, Truman actually was surprised that Nagasaki was bombed so soon on August 9th. Also, August 9th is the date that the Soviets make the surprise attack on Manchuria. And August 10th, Truman orders a stop on the atomic bombings, further bombings without his approval. And he says this to his cabinet, and Henry Wallace's diary says, quoted Truman talking about this, and the thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrible. He didn't like the idea of killing, as he said, all those kids. And so Truman kind of had a change of heart, and I think was surprised by Nagasaki. Another thing that happened too was that Hiroshima was the number one target. Originally had been Kyoto. That was the the original historic capital of Japan, major cultural and educational center. And Stimson was livid that Kyoto could not be bombed. He went right to the top to Truman, and he basically created a false dichotomy of Kyoto is this civilian thing, of the civilian cultural institution, but Hiroshima is military. Now, granted, there was a major military command base in Hiroshima, but there was also a lot of civilians there. It was a city. It wasn't just, and so it seemed, if you look at Truman's diaries, Truman seemed to think of Hiroshima as some kind of strictly 100% military base, when it really was a city that happened to have a base in it. And Truman basically got cold feet on the idea of further bombing. And that's him saying, stop all further bombing, could be argued as the origin of presidential authority, requiring presidential authority to bomb, to drop an A-bomb. So next slide. So there is, oh crap, what just happened here?
No, it's the slide deck. I'm not sure what warped it, but it's just the way it came out.
I'm going to have to find a copy of my own slides, just a second.
In such the event, the Allies would be faced with the enormous task of destroying an armed force of 5 million men and 5,000 suicide
Oh wait, you're combining two slides on one.
Oh,
here, I got it. I got it.
Sorry.
So what I was saying here is,
If
okay,
you pull up the deck and add a shared screen, we can use your original deck.
okay. No, I can. Okay, I see where we're at. Sorry. So after the war, in 1947, Stimson sort of published almost some apologetics around why did we have to do this. This was published in February of 47 in Harper's. In such an event, I'll read it here. In such an event, the Allies would be faced with the enormous task of destroying an armed force of 5 million men and 5,000 suicide aircraft belonging to a race which had already amply demonstrated its ability to fight literally to the death. We estimated that if we should be forced to carry this plan to its conclusion, the major fighting would not end until the latter part of 1946 at the earliest. I was informed that such operations may be expected to cost over 1 million casualties to American forces alone. Additional large losses might be expected among our allies, and of course, if our campaign were successful and if we could judge by previous experience, enemy casualties would be much larger than our own. Next slide. So that is kind of Stimson trying to cover his, to give history sort of a reason why this whole thing happened. There's a bunch of slides between those two.
Give me a second. Let me do a quick check.
Okay. So Stimson's narrative, there's two real narratives of why we did this, and both of them were mentioned in Mark's presentation, and this was the first that Mark mentions. And he's basically, this is quoting, this is the history that Stimson wanted to be remembered. Because if you phrase it this way, that the A-bomb was an alternative to invasion, you could almost say that he should be given a Nobel Prize, a Peace Prize for dropping it, because it was a humanitarian gesture. Because look at how many lives were saved of invasion versus Hiroshima being the sacrificial victims to prevent millions of million U.S. casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. And that really is a narrative that's false, because it assumes that the only alternative that we had was a full-scale invasion. And okay, let me look at my slide. And also,
the other set. Let me try to toss them to screen.
Okay. It was never, an invasion of the home islands was never imminent. November 45 was the earliest start. The main island of Honshu would not be invaded until 46. Those casualty estimates of 1 million are grossly inflated. The military knew the number was going to be far less. Also, that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, I think, was probably more important in the Japanese mind than the than the USA bombs, because that was basically an imminent threat that was just coming at them.
We now have the slides up.
So this whole blockade, the whole idea of starving them out, and LeMay was just utterly hammering them with incendiaries and just burning out the cities. I mean, Tokyo was completely burned out except for the Imperial Palace and whatnot. So we also knew at the time, via broken diplomatic ciphers, that Japan was actually willing to, they were on the brink of surrendering. They'd actually gone to the Soviets as neutral parties, asking them to broker peace with the U.S. Of course, they didn't know that the Soviets had already told the U.S. that we're agreeing to attack Japan. We're not going to be neutral for much longer. And the big issue is that the Potsdam Declaration was very inflammatory in certain regards, in that it didn't say anything about the status of the emperor. And depending on how you read the Potsdam Declaration, you may interpret it as the emperor would be removed, or possibly even brought up as a war criminal and hanged. That's a possibility too. And Japan culturally was an empire, and they couldn't be without an emperor. And that was basically a non-starter. They were willing to agree to Potsdam Declaration except for the emperor. In fact, they even telegraphed, or they even sent a message as such on August 10th. And the trouble here is that even Stimson and Churchill were both telling to Truman that we can end this war if we just agree to keep Hirohito on in a symbolic role. And Truman was under a lot of pressure not to allow that, because Secretary of State Burns wanted Japan to, quote, grovel. And the irony of all of this is that MacArthur knew that he had to keep Hirohito around, and created this whole false narrative that Hirohito knew nothing about Pearl Harbor and the war, and it was entirely fought by his warmongering government, who conveniently had committed seppuku by that point, or after the end of the war. And so we could have ended this if we just said, look, fine, let's end this. Hirohito stays. But the trouble is that the American people had personified hatred in this one emperor person, to the point where the graffiti on the nukes themselves had like messages to Hirohito personally written on them. And so all of a sudden you've got Truman in a state of basically agreeing to peace with Japan in what could be viewed as a capitulation that could politically come back to devastate him, when all these people are saying, my kid didn't come home just so we could guarantee Hirohito a role for life. So that was really kind of a problem too. I mean, we could have done a lot of other things to end the war. We could have just sat back and done nothing and let the Russians take care of it. We could have. They were starving. There was a lot of alternative.
Well, one of the things I would point out, though, is that the American leadership really didn't understand how the Japanese viewed the emperor, nor was it clear until well after the war to most Americans, and I'm not sure it was familiar to our leadership even, that Hirohito had not been integrally involved with the decision to go to war.
Yeah, I've heard that historians looking at this afterwards actually think that he did have a lot more of a role. But what was interesting is during his lifetime, it was basically forbidden to talk about it, and even long after the war.
I agree. It was part of our narrative to try to justify our leaving him in charge, that we did overwrite history and downplay the extent to which he was briefed on Pearl Harbor before it went in, and he gave his approval to that.
We would never hide war crimes by the Japanese in China or talk about the emperor being innocent. Never.
Nor would we hide war crimes by Nazi rocket scientists that are going to send us to the moon and allow us to build better ICBMs. But oh, was that the outside voice? Oops. Well, anyway, that's not my slide. So next slide. Let me hope this is the right one. So was the bomb necessary? And there's an alternate narrative which the previous presentation mentioned as well, and it came from Gar Alperovitz. And the narrative is that Japan was going to surrender eventually, and that this was strictly a show of force for the Soviets. I don't really like that, and I've got kind of a third reason for this, that basically dropping the bomb was inevitable. And there's some, the historian Alex Wellerstein goes into a lot of detail about this on his website, and I think it's really compelling. I kind of will blame the Soviet playwright, or the Russian playwright Chekhov, for why the bomb was dropped. If you start developing a nuclear weapon in Act 1, you have to drop it in Act 3. So the Manhattan Project at this point had cost $2 billion 1940s dollars. So that's $28 billion today. And that doesn't still sound like as much as it was when you consider that we had a much smaller GDP. And so the Manhattan Project was a single line item that was between probably 0.5% to 1% of the total amount of money spent on World War I or World War II. And Groves absolutely had to produce results. We saw what happened to Howard Hughes with getting grilled before Congress to the Spruce Goose. They weren't even sure if the bomb was going to work. If the Manhattan Project had failed, Groves would very likely have been eviscerated by Congress. People would be like, why did you spend $2 billion on this crazy science idea that could have been buying more guns and aircraft and armor for keeping our soldiers safe? So I think that it was inevitable that that bomb had to be dropped, regardless of any other considerations, except for the fact that it cost too much money, that they couldn't decide that we've spent $2 billion in R&D, we have two workable weapons, let's not drop them. That was never an option. Next slide. So also ethics in the bomb. There is something I kind of wanted to mention. I'm not going to talk. The previous presentation talked quite a bit about the fire raids in the firebombing of Tokyo, and that in one night it was the deadliest raid in history. That's more casualties than the A-bomb. So what that basically means is that all the A-bomb does is give one B-29 the power as 334 of LeMay's B-29s filled with incendiaries. So yes, I understand. I want to be clear. I'm not trying to minimize the suffering of atomic bomb survivors, but I don't think enough press is given to what exactly it was like to be in the middle of a firebombing scenario. I mean, there are reports, and this is going to get graphic, so content warning, of the tar in the streets melting and people trying to run to escape, getting caught in the tar, being stuck there, and being forced to stand there until their bodies catch flame and they go up like candles. This is pretty brutal stuff. And what I'd like to change the narrative, and instead of questioning, was the bomb justified, question the ethics of strategic bombing as a whole. And this is what I think is completely lost. Prior to World War II, the rules of engagement were pretty clear. You go after the combatants, not the civilians. Cities were allowed to be shelled and bombarded only if they were basically surrounded and refused to submit to occupation. Then you could shell them. Air power in prior wars, in World War I, for example, was generally limited to frontline support, hitting the enemy in the front, and as an extension, bombarding cities that were not surrendering. The idea that you could bombard a city that had mixed civilian and military population, that would have basically been considered horrific prior to World War II. And in 1932, Japan bombed Shanghai and was absolutely condemned for it. And the Luftwaffe in 1937 basically did a favor to Franco during the Civil War in Spain and bombed Guernica. And it was considered a major atrocity of the time period, to the point where Pablo Picasso's famous Guernica painting, these things were viewed as simply not okay by anybody. And it's very interesting because FDR, on September 1st of 39, long before the U.S. entered the war, sent a letter to combatants. Can you, next slide? So he appeals, next slide, please. He appeals to Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Poland that the ruthless bombing from the air of civilians in unfortified cities of population during the course of the hostilities which has raged in various quarters of the earth in the past few years, which has resulted in the maiming and death of thousands of defenseless women and children, has profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity. If resort is had to this sort of inhuman barbarism during the period of tragic conflagration which the world is now confronted, hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings who have no responsibility for and who are not even remotely participating in the hostilities which have broken out now will lose their lives. I am therefore addressing this urgent appeal to every government which may be engaged in hostilities publicly to affirm its determination that its armed forces shall in no event and under no circumstances undertake bombardment from the air of civilian populations or unfortified cities upon the understanding that the same rules of warfare will be scrupulously observed by all their opponents. I request an immediate reply. And interestingly enough, Hitler says, sure, we agree. Neville Chamberlain says, sure, we agree. And very quickly, and this is, if you look at Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, he paints a really compelling picture of the whole series of events that happened, whereby mistakes, miscalculations generally started pushing the narrative that it was okay to bomb cities. And I just think this is probably the single most important point in World War II, is that before, bombing a city was unthinkable. After bombing a city was perfectly normal, and it was the way that you won a war. So with that, next slide, last slide actually, I leave you with a few resources for further study.
And I'd like to chime in on this. I think Ryan is exactly on target, that the morality that's okay at the beginning of a war gets worse as the war goes on. And that's very typical. I mean, if you look all the way back to the 30 Years' War and to the ancient wars, that's a very common practice. No excuse for it, but there's an explanation for it because people become progressively brutalized. One of the other interesting things is to see how that progressed in the Civil War with Sherman's March to the Sea. It became a war against civilians, and entirely against civilians in his particular operation. So, I mean, this is not unprecedented, but it's definitely not pretty. And Ryan is quite on target with the ethics.
Yeah, I mean, they tried to push a narrative that Japan commingled its industry, its wartime industry, and its civilian populations to such a point that they said that there was a drill press in every Japanese home. And that's obviously clearly untrue, but it's also interesting because a number of these things also happened because of discrete accidents. They were trying to hit they were trying to hit a petroleum refinery, and they hit some civilians instead. And so the adversary assumed that they were intending to hit the civilians, and therefore that they could hit civilians too. There was a tragic case where the Germans sent out bombers to a city in France. The bombers got confused and they bombed a German city, and they didn't know any better. But then the Germans assumed that the French or that the Allies had bombed that city and used that as a justification to escalate hostilities against civilians. So Daniel Ellsberg, I think, does a really brilliant job of talking about the sequence of events that led to cities being off limits as bombing targets to cities being the norm as bombing targets. And it pervades warfare after that. I mean, right now today, how do we win a war? We bomb the crap out of them. That's how we get our objective.
Interviews with Ellsberg on NPR, if you want to check that out. He did an interview in the last year on that. So I want to roll back to one of the earlier questions, because the last two slides that we've got are on Olympic and Coronet, because the question father and son asked was, what are the quality of troops defending the home islands? And the answer to that's pretty crappy. I mean, even though it was a third of the Japanese military force, it was the guys who were least combat ready, just as the German reserves were at home and they were pulling recruits out of the schools. And when they talk about 400,000 to 500,000 civilians having mobilized, these people were literally given spears and pitchforks because they couldn't be equipped.
Yeah.
Here are a couple of slides to show the plans for Olympic and Coronet had we not had an end to the war based on the Soviet invasion and the A-bomb drop. You can see that they were going to bring people in essentially from the Central Pacific and come in initially to Kyushu, which is the southern island. And that was going to be a really ugly fight. S&T did a game on Operation Olympic, and I actually stole some of their slides here because they were pretty good. This is actually World at War's diagram from one of their magazines. And you can see Kyushu, this is one heck of a mountainous island. There are very few beachheads. There are about 5 landing zones that are possible. And they figured it was going to take them a couple of months to clear the beaches and set up airfields. Nonetheless, penetrate into the hinterland. It was going to be Iwo and Okinawa both written large. And the Army was expecting a lot of casualties. There were going to be not only Marine forces in this one, but significant Army forces, and the Army forces would outnumber the Marines, I think, in these operations for the first time. You can see that, essentially, they thought they might have up to about 800 possible kamikazes. But look at the geography of Kyushu. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But I mean, it's just ugly. This is really rough, relatively mountainous terrain. Okay. And the landing zones that they were most looking at were right down in here. I mean, there were landing zones along these side sectors, but essentially there were no landing zones they wanted to try close to the home islands or the ferries across. So I mean, that's the real part that I wanted people to get a sense of. And this is a really good overview. So I think I've answered that question. We had one other, which was, let's see here. I find it in the, come on now. I thought there was another general question and I'm missing it right now. If I've missed you, post again, please. I know what it is. Here it is. This was an off-topic question for the end of the show from Robert. He was asking about, particularly to Mark, was it a mistake to decommission all the battleships in the 90s?
Well, yeah, I sure would have enjoyed keeping around too. With unlimited money, sure, we keep the battleships around. But remember that at that point, those are platforms going out 40 years old. These 600-pound steam plants that nobody was trained to operate anymore. So the training and the maintenance was ridiculous. The number of people we needed to run them was ridiculous. To me, there's nothing as far as naval gunfire support, nothing like a spread of 16-inch shells. But I'm not sure how many we had left.
It was costing $1 million.
There were a number of plot complications.
1990s dollars to run those things.
Yeah, there are a number of plot complications though, because even with the refits, reducing the size of the crew and putting in some more modern cabling, there was a tremendous amount of old stuff there that deteriorates. I mean, it was old style wiring and everything else. In my career,
you don't have that in your house.
Who reconditions part of the ship out of Waterville Arsenal. And they talked about reconditioning the 16-inch guns. In terms of ammo, there was still a supply because I actually worked with the real government surplus people, and we were involved in demilling the old 16-inch shells at Crane, the Naval Test Site in Indiana. I was actually on site when they were trying to take some of those shells apart to turn them into an inert product, because we were there during the startup. The 16-inch shells having been retained would not have been a problem, and in the short run there would have been supplies. But the other thing is they had started to manufacture these 16-inch rocket-assisted projectiles, which were entirely new charge that they did in Vietnam, which let them actually fire far beyond the horizon. It made the range fantastic. I mean, I think it was 24 miles or something.
The latest ones I heard were up to 72.
Yeah, because it was pretty impressive. It dropped the weighted rounds in half and substituted propellant. And it was sort of the early version of the smart bomb. It didn't have the detailed guidance that you got with the newer stuff. But those ships were just friggin' huge and very difficult to maintain. I mean, even if you look at the museum ships, they spend a tremendous amount of money trying to keep rust away from those things. But they are definitely a great equalizer.
It's going to be expensive to keep them operating. My plan back in the 90s was don't try. Rip out, shut down most of those boilers, rip out the others, and put in about 6 gas turbines so that our maintenance and training pipelines are the same, whether you go into a Spruance or a Perry or you go into Iowa. They won't do 33 knots anymore, but they'll do 18. They're still really impressive platforms. And we just, keep some of them around and keep the crew necessary to operate them on board. Like one operating out of Diego Garcia along the Persian Gulf and one operating in the Far East. Show the flag because they're very impressive. Whenever we do actually have to, we're going to have to send them to combat. We have reserve crews that know how to use and operate those guns. Reserves will love them. So that was my plan, but nobody listened to me. Anyway, I like them because they're pretty ships. They're impressive ships. Nobody has these anymore. And selling those into some foreign port, people are saying, "Oh, the Americans, they really got it together. They could put this thing in there on a level that sometimes carriers didn't." And the Marines would complain every time we decommissioned a gunship. The Marines complained about it. They saw that's one less artillery tube that's going to be supporting us going inshore. Okay. So with the other questions, somebody asked a question. I thought about the don't even know now about the implications of having the bomb.
But originally, just as a side.
Did anyone want to address that?
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second. Just as an aside, the original shell was 2,700 pounds. Yeah,
there are a couple actually. The high. Interestingly, while these things weigh over a ton, the amount of actually explosive in it is pretty small. The armor-piercing projectile on the 16-inch gun has about 40 pounds of explosive in it. Most of the kinetic energy is the shell itself coming at near supersonic speed. When you think about it, when you watch them loading one of those shells into a muzzle, what you're really delivering as far as energy were the powder bags behind it that were giving you the kinetic energy, which is most of what it's hitting with. Most what the kinetic energy hitting with it. Okay. Yeah.
My opinion is that Groves was going to use the bomb. I think there's some statements that he made even before the testing at Trinity.
Ryan's back, Merle.
We're going to test it and then we're going to drop a couple. So I think for the $1 billion or $2 billion, actually the B-29 program was more expensive than the Manhattan project.
Yeah, I think
they were going to drop
along the lines
bomb.
of just these generals and those guys just didn't understand what they were unleashing, and they just were treating it like another artillery piece.
Exactly.
They just thought it was just going to be another bomb.
And the irony is that some of the scientists were actually realizing what was going to happen. And Niels Bohr in particular wanted to tell the Soviet Union about this in advance and wanted to set up basically a regime where they knew that the US is developing it, and after it's used on Japan, it is going to be put under international control, and that way neither the U.S. nor the Soviets we could come up will have our own arsenals. And it would have avoided the Cold War nuclear arms race, because that Bohr knew that an arms race would happen. If we just tested it and dropped it and caught Stalin by surprise, Stalin would have to have one too.
Mhm.
And the US actually thought that it could monopolize the majority of the world's uranium supplies. They didn't realize how uranium was tightly, how dispersed uranium actually is around the globe. But they thought that they could keep a monopoly on the bomb. And yeah, so the world would have been very different if they'd actually listened to the scientists. Yeah,
What happened?
and basically made an agreement in advance to put the bomb under international control before it was dropped for the first time.
Reminds you a lot of H.G. Wells' The World Set Free, which brings me to the seminar we're going to be running tomorrow. Please tune in for our 19th century science fiction authors. Just wanted to get the plug in there. So.
Well, I think that,
I'm talking later tonight all about Chernobyl tourism. So there's also another talk on Chernobyl too tonight.
yeah, we've got 2 Chernobyl talks and 1 radiological talk tonight. We do the 19th century views of the future tomorrow morning. We've got a total of, let's see, we've done 2, so we've got 9 total lectures and seminars still to go. So please consider joining us and telling your friends. Thank you all for joining us, and I think this is our break point. Any last comments or questions? Going on?
Turn in your tickets if you haven't.
Twice, and that's a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Be safe and have a wonderful weekend.